The story begins with Chen looking ahead, partially covering his face with his hand. In the background, a starry sky and a full moon illuminate the night. He is in a tall building when, suddenly, a middle-aged man accompanied by some women approaches and greets him respectfully, calling him Mr. Chen. The man raises his glass of wine in a toast, and with a bright look, he praises Chen as a promising young man. However, Chen remains calm and rejects the compliment. The man doubts his cruelty, but he continues to insist, offering him more alcohol and trying to convince him to trust him, assuring him that he does not have to worry about anything. However, Chen looks at him disapprovingly while his interlocutor drinks, and to distract him, he observes his own reflection in the glass of wine, and for a moment he gets lost in his thoughts. His name resonates in his mind, but he no longer recognizes himself. Convinced, he concludes that everyone around him is hypocritical and they only treat him that way because he is a millionaire, including the man and the women sitting on the sofa next to him, whose falseness is evident. Soon a young woman named Jian Mai appears, who comments that Chen's future wife will be very lucky. The man who accompanies them, however, corrects her, saying that Chen is single and is one of the most coveted parties of the moment. Jian, a little embarrassed, sits next to him and soon realizes his sophistication and high standards. Holding a business card, he wishes for an opportunity to be noticed. Decided, Jian approaches and begins to praise Chen, talking about the importance of balancing the family and the career. He listens to her in silence, then she leans discreetly and hands him her business card, waiting for him to accept it. Chen picks up the card with a slight smile and Jian smiles radiantly. On the table there is a bottle of alcohol. The man realizes that Chen has barely drunk, but still offers to take him home. Chen firmly refuses, saying that his house is close enough to go alone. He sighs, walks towards his car, holding his jacket with one hand and putting the other in the door handle. Suddenly a loud moan draws his attention near the wheels of the vehicle. He crouches and finds a little orange cat. Raising it in his arms, Chen comments that the kitten was lucky to have been noticed, because otherwise he could have been run over. Then he lets go of the kitten, which quickly runs away before disappearing in the dark. The cat looks at him one last time. The headlights of the car shine intensely, illuminating the night. Chen sits in the front seat, closes his eyes and relaxes. When he opens them again, he looks out the window and sees the same orange kitten next to two adult cats. At that moment, he remembers his own family and realizes that he has not visited them in a long time. Decided, he starts the car and puts his hand on the gear lever, preparing to drive home. With the seat belt on, he looks in the pocket of his shirt and pulls out a large amount of presentation cards. Among them is that of Jian, marked with a trace of lipstick. Chen observes the cards for a long time, thoughtful, then without hesitation, he throws them all away. The cards fall disorderly to the ground, some are carried by the wind and others he simply steps on when he starts without looking back. Chen advances under the lights of the city at night, with many visible skyscrapers in the background. He keeps one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on his chin. He looks out the window while listening to music. After a while, his gaze goes to the road and his hand firmly grabs the wheel. He increases the speed with confidence, following the words of the song, about 500 km per hour. Suddenly a huge truck approaches him, with the headlights illuminating it. The eyes of the protagonist open at the same time, horror and fear are visible in his gaze. Suddenly a girl calls him. She wears a long dress and a bicycle. The girl says that it is forbidden to smoke there. Chen closes his eyes, holding his head with a hand that suddenly begins to hurt him. He opens an eye and tries to understand what has happened to him exactly and where he is. The girl in the long dress is in front of him, with a surprised expression on her face. The people in the background are surprised by his carelessness. The boy sitting on the bench coughs, and the protagonist is confused for not recognizing who is sitting next to him. His eyes open completely, of total incomprehension. It seemed that everything was just a dream. The protagonist is still perplexed by what is happening, and suddenly notices something under the incomprehensible gaze of his partner. He notices his reflection next to the bench where they are sitting. His eyes widen even more and sweat appears on his face. He wonders if this is some kind of time travel. The boy does not understand absolutely anything about what is happening. The dark-haired girl looks down uncomfortably, maintaining silence and waiting for at least some reaction from Chen. The protagonist is taken by the face. The man tells him that his behavior is not usual and that this should not be done under any circumstance. The stranger, a tall man, tightens his hand in a fist and says that he hopes the protagonist has a happy future and recovers from a broken heart. The protagonist is bothered by the stubbornness of the stranger in his words. His friend sitting next to him on the bench is confused, not understanding what happened to the young man. Chen leans, holding a cigarette in his hands. The protagonist's facial expression becomes immensely somber and he asks the tall man seriously and coldly who he is. The horror is visible on the face of the tall man in the face of such a reaction and decides that he needs to leave, saying that Chen does not deserve so much attention. Meanwhile, the girl simply looks at him in silence, but then finally decides to speak. The girl says that if Chen really wants to ignore her, that's fine, but makes it clear that he does not want a relationship now and that his opinion will not change anything. Chen looks at her worried when he mentions it. The girl also tells him that if he continues, he will tell his mother about his smoking. The protagonist does not even remember who his mother is, but he is afraid that she will discover it. He gets extremely angry and does not understand how the girl knows about his mother. The friend still does not look with incomprehension, and the tall man is getting angrier and angrier with the passing of the minutes. The girl hands him a bottle of water and informs him that he should appear for the enrollment later. Chen rejects the offer and the tall man complains that the protagonist is pretending to be a tough guy. Suddenly the girl remains silent and does not understand the behavior of the hero. Little by little, he extends his hand in which he holds the bottle of water towards him, then leaves the bottle in the seat, and with an unsatisfied look, he turns around and leaves. But Chen does not comment on any of this. He only observes how the girl and the tall man go by bicycle. He asks his friend if he really confessed his feelings. The friend puts his hand on his shoulder and asks him to stop pretending. The protagonist realizes that this is the girl he was in love with when he was a student. He turns his interrogating look at the boy next to him and asks him who he is. His best friend named Wang Zibo grabs him by the shirt screaming that he is his best friend and that he always smoked with him. The protagonist questions if it is that Zibo who went to Iraq. This makes his friend even more angry. After a while, they walk down a typical street in China, where there are many three-story shops and houses. The friend asks him not to drink so much because of the enrollment. The protagonist replies that he understands. After a while, they arrive at the classroom. The protagonist receives congratulations for having passed the school. His teacher, with a slight smile and his eyes closed, gives him a graduation notice. His friend is surprised that he has passed the first level exam, and Chen mentions that he also passed the second level without any problem. Then the young man looks at his smiling teacher named Lao Tzu. The protagonist reminds him that this teacher will not resist a disease caused by cigarettes, and that unfortunately, he will not be able to attend his funeral because he will be abroad in the future. Meanwhile, Wang thanks the teacher for his attention. At that moment, Chen realizes that he has indeed gone back in time. Suddenly the young man notices a red pack of cigarettes on the table, next to a pen and a pile of papers. The protagonist quickly takes the cigarettes for himself, under the surprised looks of the teacher and his friend, and asks Lao to smoke less. Chen looks at the teacher with a pack of cigarettes in his hand and reminds him that teaching in high school is already difficult, but smoking will hurt him even more. The teacher looks at Chen with evident misunderstanding, since he clearly did not expect such words from him, but the teacher laughs lightly and tells the protagonist that he will smoke less in the future. The protagonist says that now he will take out his cigarettes to be sure, which surprises his friend and teacher even more. The tall boy is outraged, wondering why Chen was accepted into the most important university. A girl tries to defend him, saying that Chen always had good grades, and that his conflict is just a misunderstanding. The boy does not want to know anything and is outraged. The girl continues to defend Chen and tries to explain the reason for his smoking. The boy interrupts her and calls the protagonist a criminal and a fighter. At that moment, Chen and his friend appear behind him. Chen approaches the girl he was in love with and asks her where he is going to study now. The girl blushes a little and replies that she is going to study at Tongkai University. The young man tells her that he is going to study at the neighboring University of Finance and Economics. The boy next door tries to humiliate him, but he does not succeed because the protagonist does not even pay attention to him. He asks what time it is, and the girl looks at his watch saying that it is 5:20. The protagonist takes his hand and asks where he bought the watch, and also suggests that that time means I love you. The tall boy pushes him outraged, accusing him of trying to reaffirm his feelings for the girl, but Chen does not react to this. He decides to move away while the tall boy screams angry behind him. Meanwhile, a speaker, screwed to a high post, emits sounds of music. The rays of the sun shine through the windows, illuminating an empty classroom where the Chinese flag stands out intensely on the wall. Chen walks quietly outside the school with a poster in his hands, observing the uniformed students walking close. He looks to one side and sees a group of boys playing basketball and trying to basket the ball in the hoop. The students who walk towards the hoop communicate and laugh with each other, discussing something interesting. The protagonist observes the sun, which illuminates his tired but relaxed face. He closes his eyes, enjoying the sun. The last rays of light that gradually illuminate the street disappear, giving way to the night. He walks with his best friend. The protagonist thinks that for the first time in several years, he has the opportunity to return home. Someone behind them calls his name, which causes Chen and Sibo to turn around. They notice the girl Zhou Zhang and the boy they met at school before. The protagonist is not happy to see them again. Zhou approaches him on a bicycle and says that he and his friend did not write anything in his notebook for his classmates. The protagonist looks at her in silence, lowering his curious gaze. Zhou, slightly embarrassed, takes a notebook for his classmates from the bicycle basket. He holds the notebook in his hand and hands it to Chen, asking him to write something as a memory for her. The tall boy looks at the protagonist with even more irritation and discontent than he expected, demanding that Chen write something good instead of looking at Zhou. The girl blushes a little and asks the young man to stop looking at her, but the protagonist excuses himself by saying that he is only looking at the notebook. He opens his classmate's notebook and begins to see what is already written there. The notebook is full of good wishes. His attention is directed to a poem by William Jadds that the tall boy, called Gaon, wrote and put as his own. Zhou points with his pen the blank page of the notebook and demands that the young man write something instead of reading the entire notebook. After that, the protagonist decides to give the notebook to his best friend to write it first, but the friend still does not know what to write and therefore, he feels embarrassed. Wang writes that he wants Zhou to become more and more beautiful with the years. Then the notebook returns to Chen's hands and he should write something about it. But apart from the desire to stay young, he cannot invent anything. After thinking for a moment, the protagonist begins to slowly write his wishes in Zhou's notebook. He writes a little poem with a play on words, but the tall boy makes fun of him and the other girl thinks that the poem is unique. Zhou carefully looks at the notebook and notices that the verse is very well written. She warns Chen that he will not tell his mother that he smoked. Gaon does not encourage him to go home, citing the fact that it will soon get dark. Chen and Wang saw the group leave. His friend is outraged because he forced him to sign the notebook first. The protagonist bothers him by asking if he feels something for Zhou, which his friend immediately denies. They walk together and the protagonist suggests going to a hamburger place tomorrow. His best friend is very surprised and Chen explains the choice by saying that he has a family dinner tonight. Sibo looks at the protagonist and asks him if he can skip dinner. The protagonist walks down the alley and leaves his friend alone, saying that he does not understand anything. The friend looks at him without understanding, without saying a word. The protagonist walks down the narrow alley, which is lit by a lighthouse and signs from several establishments. The young man remembers several moments of his childhood. For example, when a child came home with a dirty school uniform and his mother scolded him for it, or when, being a teenager, his mother asked him to bring him food but he refused. He also remembers a specific day sitting late at night with a huge pile of textbooks, doing his homework. The protagonist remembers a middle-aged man in the club adulating him in the future. Chen thinks about his childhood, adolescence and his future, who already knows what is going to happen. The protagonist approaches the red door that is closed behind the metal fence. He looks at this door and stands still. A slight smile touches his lips and a lonely lamp illuminates his face while he is at the entrance. The young man raises his hand towards the door and begins to hit it, demanding that his mother open it. His mother suddenly opens the door, bothers him to scream so loud and tells him to always forget his keys. The protagonist enters the house complaining that it is hot and needs to turn on the air conditioning, while wondering where his father is. He takes remote control of the air conditioning in his hands. His mother informs him that his father is still at work. Then he gives the protagonist a plate with several slices of watermelon. Chen is surprised and soon begins to eat. He thanks his mother and she tells him to eat quietly while he eats on the sofa. His mother asks him to shower later and put his university admission documents on the table. The protagonist happily eats the watermelon and finds himself thinking that the watermelon still tastes the same, as familiar as before. In a tall building, the lights are on in the middle of a dark night. Chen's mother holds the university acceptance notice in her hands. She smiles proudly and is happy that now there is a university student in the family. The protagonist is in the bathroom, listening to his mother's plans for his future life. The woman is already thinking about her university graduation and her grandchildren. The protagonist ironically smiles as he looks in the mirror. Mentally he says that his mother will not see his grandchildren in the next 35 years. The protagonist is distracted from his thoughts by the noise coming from the living room of his apartment. The young man happily leaves the shower when he realizes that his father has already returned home. The protagonist's father stays in the room and undresses his shirt, confirming his return at the same time, despite the obvious fatigue. Something important draws Chen's father's attention. He takes remote air conditioning control and adjusts the temperature to keep the family comfortable. Suddenly, the furious mother invades the room with a coat and a pack of cigarettes, accusing Chen of smoking. The protagonist tries to justify to his parents that the teacher gave him cigarettes to pass his exams, but the mother does not believe it and accuses the father of not paying attention to the son. The father says it is too early for Chen to smoke, and the mother adds that the father should also smoke less, and it is time for everyone to sit at the table. Now the protagonist's parents are sitting in bed and she asks him to give money to his son to take him to college. The father says he should let his son do whatever he wants. The mother looks at her husband with concern and complains that over time, her son has begun to listen to her less, although they have always encouraged his ideas. The father points out that the son may not be the best student, but his intelligence does not let him fall, and they must support him. Chen's mother carefully listens to everything her husband says about her son's future. He looks the other way, lost in his own thoughts about him. It begins to dawn on a common street in China. The street lights are still on. At the table at night there is an alarm clock that indicates that it is time to get up. The protagonist, without thinking about anything, is partially covered with a blanket. He turns his gaze towards the alarm clock that is quietly on the table at night, then looks around the room, especially towards the sleeve in the shelf, and realizes that he definitely wants to stay there. Meanwhile, a strong stream of water flows from the tap of the bathroom. The mother comments that Chen got up early today. The protagonist brushes his teeth calmly and looks at his tired mother, telling her that he is hungry. The mother grumbles and tells him that he can buy his own breakfast because she is going to go to bed. Chen says nothing, but he thinks that this is clearly not the way to raise his son. After a while, the young man arrives near a street food stand in a children's park and asks the price of an egg pancake. After the seller's answer, he is mentally surprised by the low price and asks for 2 loaves for him. Chen wonders where the payment and the code are. The seller looks at him completely disconcerted and does not understand what code he is talking about. The protagonist seems to receive an electric discharge when he realizes that it is 2002 and cannot pay with his cell phone, and realizes that he has no money with him. The mother did not leave him anything, and the seller asks him if he is going to buy it. The protagonist refuses and quickly invents an excuse, saying that pancakes are harmful because his grandmother told him that. Then he goes home disappointed, mentally complaining that the payment system and life in the past were extremely inconvenient. Chen is abruptly distracted from his thoughts when paying attention to something in front of him. Zhao is running, visibly breathless, in a racing suit. The protagonist calls her, and she immediately directs her attention to him. Zhao seems surprised, she did not expect to see him now. The girl looks at him and asks him what he is doing there so early, since it is only 6:30 in the morning. Suddenly a thought crosses his mind, but he does not have time to finish the idea he just had. The protagonist greets her, but she does not interrupt him quickly and tells him that he knows why he is there. The girl puts her hands on her hips and repeats once again that she does not want to have a relationship now. The protagonist is paralyzed because he did not expect such a conclusion from the girl. Zhao assumes that it was precisely to observe her that he got up so early. She looks at him with her arms crossed and asks him if he was trying to get his attention when he ignored her yesterday. Chen keeps silent, gets uncomfortable and listens to the girl say that he is a good boy, but that he does not need a relationship, and that they can only discuss it after graduation. The protagonist realizes that this is precisely the reason why they are not dating yet. Zhao continues to say that he does not want to get distracted. He thinks to himself about the promise he made throughout the school of not having a relationship. Zhao asks him not to comment on anything, because everything is clear, and Chen agrees, saying that she is smart. Then he invites her to breakfast, where they can talk. Zhao feels embarrassed and points out that he should invite him, because he helps him a lot with his studies. The protagonist agrees with her and suggests going to a store near the police station that has fried soy milk and beans. He says it will be delicious. The restaurant has a bright yellow color, and there are several common and transcendent policemen. Acquaintance greets Zhao and she greets him happily and courteously. Meanwhile, the protagonist enjoys his favorite food. Uncle Giant tells him that Chen eats too much and does not understand the harm of eating in excess. The protagonist looks at him questioning while he eats another cake. The young man claims that he will be in perfect shape until the age of 30. Zhao asks how he knows, and he explains that a few days ago he met a divine, so he knows his future for sure and then continues to eat. Chen also says that he will be rich and successful, but unfortunately without a wife because he does not have a marriage line. The girl gets angry and says that this is absurd, because men quickly change their opinion and feelings. Chen replies that a divine taught him to count the fortunes of the palms, explaining that each pattern of the palm is unique and shows the fate of a person. The young man points out that the loaves made by the owner or his wife will be different. He tells them that the owner's loaves are smooth, but his wife's make them with folds. Zio is skeptical with such a statement. Then they both look at each other disconcerted and somewhat uncomfortable towards the owners of the restaurant to see how they work and make the loaves. She watches as the owner and his wife make the loaves for themselves. The girl pays attention to the board on which the loaves are and sees that they really have completely different textures and shapes. She observes it with surprise, and at that moment the protagonist thinks to himself that she does not have basic knowledge of bakery, because the shape of the bread depends on its filling, and that is the whole secret. He draws Zio's attention and extends his hand, which makes the girl quickly move away to avoid the attention of the owner of the restaurant and his wife. The protagonist, with a mischievous expression on his face, thinks that with the help of guessing he can confuse a person. He extends his hand and invites the girl to see his palm. Zio asks what he is doing, but he replies that it is only guessing. After thinking about it for a while, the girl finally decides to trust him with respect to guessing. The protagonist, looking at his hand and explaining the meaning of the patterns according to Confucianism, explains to him that if the line of salvation is long, then he will be healthy and happy. Zio is surprised by this statement, since he did not expect such serious words from the protagonist. He marks a line of wisdom on his hand, saying that he likes to fantasize and that he will also be happy. He calls the marriage line confusing, and then tells him that he needs to stay away from the boys who run around her, and be more careful. The young man takes a dramatic pause and says that he seems to have discovered who his ideal husband is, which surprises her. He takes her hand and tells her that his ideal husband is right in front of her. The girl, indignant, puts her hand aside and Chen quickly thanks her for breakfast. The young man walks relaxed towards the exit of the restaurant and prepares to go home. The restaurant owner's wife looks at him with a penetrating look of suspicion. Chen tells the owner's wife that the girl paid for his breakfast. At that moment, a policeman enters the restaurant and then turns around, carefully observing the protagonist. The protagonist holds a stick in his mouth and looks at him questioning, thinking that these people seem familiar to him. The policeman is talking behind him and the restaurant owner's wife looks at him disapprovingly. The protagonist turns around, completely confused, trying to understand what is happening. The restaurant owner's wife starts talking to the policeman and points her finger at Chen. The policeman suddenly turns around and looks at the restaurant owner's wife. The policeman's eyes close in anger and dissatisfaction when he sees the young man. Chen seems to be surprised and quickly says goodbye to Zio, saying that he needs to go home urgently because he has work to do. He starts running, realizing that this policeman is Zio's father. Early in the morning, a double blue bus is at the stop of the Gan bus station and is gradually filling up with passengers. The protagonist and his best friend discuss the difference between the girls from the university and those from the high school, and the fact that unlike the school, the university is a student election. The protagonist is not happy that his friend asks him so many questions, but then his friend mentions that he saw Zio. The protagonist quickly looks out the window, and Sibo realizes that he is interested in the subject. The young man watches the girl from the window next to his father near an open car. The friend says that Zio's father's car broke down and that the protagonist has not seen her since the confrontation with his father at the restaurant. The girl notices that someone is looking at her and turns her head towards her observer. She walks away disgusted when she sees Chen. Meanwhile, the bus driver asks if everything is okay with the captain. The policeman replies that the car broke down and wanted to take his daughter to the university. The driver offers to give him a ride since he does not mind and is on his way to his destination. The attention of the police captain is attracted by a voice that asks if his car broke down. It turns out to be that tall guy named Gaon, who offers to help her by taking her to the university. The boy promises that he will keep her safe and says that there are many people on the bus, so it will be easier to reach the destination by car. The protagonist watches and thinks that the captain will refuse. The captain is tired of the failures of the day, but he does not trust the rich Gaon and believes that he has bad intentions, so he decides to ask his daughter what he prefers, if traveling by bus or with Gaon by car. Wait for your daughter's answer. At that moment, Gaon shines with hope and happiness, but Zio chooses to travel by bus. The protagonist has no words to comment on the situation. Then Chen invites his friend to sit in another seat, but Sibo refuses. He asks his best friend to move so that Zio can sit next to him. Sibo asks why the young man does not change seats, and he replies that he feels bad. The girl gets in front of the bus and stops in the aisle between Chen's seats. He looks out the window and his best friend has his eyes closed, but although he is disgusted, Sibo changes places, although he is very angry. The protagonist looks out the window, and the policeman asks him to take care of his daughter, since his universities are close. Shen says that he will definitely take care of Zio, which surprises Gaon, who is close. The bus advances quickly along the sunny road without stopping. Sibo is upset with his seat because the curtain is broken and there are still 5 hours of travel. Shen asks the teacher to give his friend a visor, since he will not be able to endure such a long trip under the sun. Then he warns Zio that it is very hot and tells him that he got up early today, so now he is going to sleep. He closes his eyes, and the girl thinks that he is trying to avoid talking to her that way. She moves away unsatisfied, and suddenly the young man puts his head on his shoulder and really falls asleep. Meanwhile, Zio's father's intuition tells him that something is not right after his daughter gets on the bus. The bus continues to travel quickly along the road without slowing down. After a while, the bus heads towards the bridge, and in the distance you can see a boat in the water. Passengers scream that it is the Yangtze Bridge, which wakes up the protagonist. He looks sleepily through the window and is distracted by the girl who is staring at him. Chen looks at her with interest. He realizes that up close she is even more beautiful than usual. Chen maintains a neutral expression, and the girl asks him if he was surprised by the sight of the bridge. Chen looks away, as if ignoring his question, and then turns abruptly towards her. The girl turns abruptly, with her eyes very open and her face completely red. The protagonist looks at her with a slight smile and asks her if she was surprised by this bridge. The girl is still in shock and looks at him with a clear blush on her cheeks, very embarrassed by what is happening on the bus. The protagonist tells the girl that he has been in this city and not only crossed the bridge, but also saw the local attractions, so it is difficult to surprise him with something. The girl looks at him as if she had a misunderstanding. After a while, they finally arrive at the bus station and prepare to get off. At the station there are several different buses that people get off. Zibo complains about the heavy suitcases, while the hero himself says that he warned him not to carry so many things. Zeo is strangely surrounded by 3 large suitcases and is surprised by the lack of things that Chen carries, but he says that everything is at the university, and that his mother will send him the rest. The girl is surprised by the ability of the protagonist to solve things, realizing that it could have been done in a simpler way. Chen calls her with a simple mind, gives her advice on how to get to his university and tells her the exact way. The girl asks him how he will get to the university, and he replies that he and his friend have already decided to take a walk through the park. The girl freezes completely and then screams calling Chen, which leaves the young man and Zibo surprised. Zeo is furious and remembers that the protagonist had promised him to take care of her. She looks at them intensely, watching their backs, waiting for some action. The people at the station closely observe what is happening. The protagonist turns towards her, visibly nervous, and asks her not to scream. He slowly extends his hand towards her, but Zeo only moves away irritated, trying to get his attention. The protagonist whispers that they must leave quickly before the passers-by think they are a couple. This statement infuriates the girl even more, and looks at Chen's outraged hand, as if trying to soften the situation. The young man offers to accompany her, and sees how a tear rolls down the cheek of the furious girl. She declares that he was leaving her. The protagonist tries to calm her down and tells her that he will help her take her things to the station and will not abandon her. The girl, annoyed, bites her hand, causing a deep shock to the passers-by, who even think that Chen could be a thug. After a while, the whole trio sits clumsily at a bus stop surrounded by suitcases and packages. Shen's hand is partially hidden in his pocket and shows a fairly strong bite mark. The girl looks guilty at the protagonist's hand, but says nothing about it. The protagonist looks at the floor, ashamed, believing that his reputation is ruined and that everyone thinks he is a shameless man. Zio also feels strange when he realizes that perhaps the protagonist wants to find a girlfriend. She feels very jealous, but understands that she cannot do anything. Her shoulders are down and calls Chen's attention by calling him by his name. The protagonist closes his eyes and sighs with difficulty when he sees the state of the girl. He opens his eyes and a slight smile is visible on his lips. Then he asks her if she is angry with him. The girl looks at him with big eyes, full of tears and shame. She lowers her eyes full of tears and sits timidly in response. The protagonist says that a lost walk in the park is not a problem, but the girl does not agree with him, shaking her head. Sebono invites him to accompany him to the university or meet later. Then his friend leaves quickly, leaving him alone. Chen is surprised by the action of his friend, while Zio remains silent. The protagonist calls the girl, who continues to cry, asks her not to worry and come with him. Zio quickly dries his tears with his hand and agrees to go with the protagonist. Chen takes care of most of the luggage, leaving the girl to carry only one suitcase. He looks ahead carefully and leaves the girl in her bedroom before moving away. The protagonist takes off his glasses and says that the problems are over. He lowers his hand towards the pocket of his pants and sees the edge of a piece of white paper. A pretty girl gave him her bedroom phone number, saying that he can contact her at any time, while a discontented girl is in the background. The protagonist holds the piece of paper in his hands and happily smiles, thinking that it is impossible to reject something like that. Meanwhile, in the background, a red poster with golden hieroglyphs is seen welcoming the students who look towards the main entrance of the university. The protagonist realizes that he had not really come here in 10 years. Among the crowd of students walking through the campus, you can see a girl with a long fringe. She is in a hurry and suddenly clashes with the protagonist, making the piece of paper they had given her fall out of her hands. With visible irritation, the protagonist looks at who pushed him. The girl begins to apologize immediately and he cannot help but notice that she is immensely beautiful. The young man smiles in response to his apology and tells him that it is not necessary. The girl thanks him and quickly flees from the scene of the collision, leaving the protagonist surprised. He picks up the fallen piece of paper and tries to remember the girl he just found. Chen continues walking and thinks about how fast this stranger fled. At that moment, two people are sitting at a table, an old man and a girl who looks happy. When the protagonist approaches that table, they ask him if he is a student, to which he confirms. The girl sitting at the table turns out to be his classmate, whose name is Sinyo. Then the girl introduces the old man, saying that he is the teacher named Wu. The teacher tells him to fill in the information and to go to the dormitory. The protagonist finishes filling in the papers and a crowd of students can be seen gathering behind him. The girl tells him that she is going to live in the third building, in room 6002. The protagonist thanks and says goodbye to the girl and the teacher. He closely observes the different university students, noting that they are much more beautiful and attractive than the students from his school. When looking at the girls, he understands what attracts the attention of other boys and why they come to this university. He sighed strongly and took the bag in his hands. Now, the young man believes that he needs to earn money before trying to find a girl. At that moment, the ad board is full of various inscriptions and papers, where it is difficult to find a specific ad, but he finally finds what suits him and hopes that it will help him make money in the future. The sky at sunset slowly turns into night and the lights turn on in the dormitory where the protagonist lives. The young man walks tired through the corridors of the dormitory, thinking about how many people there are. Chen happily smiles, thinking about how long it has been since he was in this room. He puts his hand on the door, opening it slightly and allowing a little light to enter the corridor. The protagonist thinks that his neighbors are still the same. He smiles and happily greets his neighbors, asking them if he was the last to arrive. At that moment, the protagonist attracts the attention of three people at the same time, but one of them is especially happy to see him. The boy in the yellow shirt shakes his hand and introduces himself as Zhang. His attention is directed to the remaining two neighbors. The one wearing a blue blouse introduces himself as Chan, and the other as Yen. Then two more students appear. The one wearing glasses introduces himself as Li and the other as Jin. At that moment, Han is surprised that Jin has the latest Motorola model, and Jin proudly confirms it. The protagonist is happy that they are still the same and that they have not changed at all. Yang offers cigarettes to the protagonist, saying that he is the oldest. Shen listens attentively and invites them to number themselves according to their age. When the youngest receives the cigarettes, he feels ashamed, but Li and Jin reject the cigarettes. The older boy is surprised by the rejection, and the second boy says that there are few types of cigarettes in the hostel. Jin says that those are very cheap and poor quality cigarettes. He begins to make recommendations about cigarettes, since there are lighter and tastier options. The older boy feels embarrassed and says that in his city he only smoked those cigarettes, but he had not heard of others. The protagonist thinks of the nice guys who were the students for being able to talk even about such a simple issue. Meanwhile, the young man thinks about the 4 years of training he has ahead. With a cigarette in his mouth, he looks disgusted at the dormitory door and thinks that for 4 years everything here will surprise his roommates. Upon hearing the noise and returning to the origin of the sound, his classmates ask him what he is doing. He replies that they must keep the room clean. The oldest suggests that the protagonist be the head of the room, and the others praise his decision. About cleaning, his classmates discuss how much responsibility he will have, being responsible for sleeping, eating, and even solving conflicts. The protagonist replies that he will have no problem accepting the position, and his classmates look at him surprised and with admiration. At night, words of praise are heard for the protagonist for his responsibility and courage. Morning comes and the sun shines intensely, illuminating the streets. In the morning, the protagonist wakes up to the sound of Jin's phone ringing too loudly. Lee tells Chen that he needs to go to class, then tells him that he needs a uniform. The protagonist stretches with an air of accomplishment and suddenly realizes something important. He jumps out of bed and says that it is time to find the girl. Suddenly they arrive outside and you can see several students dressed in camouflage. In class, there are a large number of girls dressed in camouflage. The protagonist says that his classmates are not very handsome or young, but Chen invites his classmates to go meet the girls. Several of his classmates are ashamed of this proposal and do not respond. The protagonist confidently approaches a group of girls and tells one of them that a military uniform is for girls to communicate with each other. Among them, the girl named Hook, with whom he already knows, greets her and she is glad to have found her again. Hook says that he is the only one of the 27 boys who dared to approach the girls. The protagonist introduces himself and asks if any of his group from the province is there. One of the girls with a beret raises her hand and says that she is from this province. Chen's roommates are impressed by his flirting skills and say that people like him are always popular. One of the girls says that the first year is very heavy and hopes that she can take care of her roommates. Confidence is visible in the protagonist's eyes and he says that he needs to help the teacher manage the group. Suddenly the young man sees the girl he met yesterday and asks who she is. Hook says he forgot to introduce her. The girl blushes deeply and moves away. Hook explains to the protagonist that this girl is called Yu and is his roommate. The girl hides behind his back and then leaves completely. Hook asks not to comment on this and explains that this girl has no parents, her grades are low and she studies with credit. The protagonist remembers that Yu is a diligent and intelligent student. Chen remembers a moment from the graduation ceremony of pre-graduate students at the university. That day Yu borrowed an incredibly beautiful dress from someone and surprised the entire university. He remembers the details of the outfit and admires the beauty of the girl. The young man remembers that his ties broke in the future, but this time he will not allow that to happen. Already in the classroom, the teacher coughs and attracts the attention of the students, saying that the meeting has already begun. The teacher carefully observes the students in the audience and invites them to introduce themselves. A girl with long red hair stands up and says her name is Yinyan. The protagonist's roommates begin to evaluate the girl and Chen is perplexed by her behavior. Shortly after, the young man's attention is attracted by the clumsy and shy voice of a girl. Yu is near the blackboard and briefly talks about herself and her hometown. Chen's roommates are not impressed by the girl, but the protagonist knows what is hidden under that mask. The teacher talks about the need to choose a director as well as a representative of the group. The oldest among Chen's roommates invites him to be the representative, and the second classmate says he can help his friends. She concentrates and thinks she should try harder because there are competitors. She goes to the shy girl and tells her to ignore the boy because they are stupid. Yu feels very embarrassed. Meanwhile, in front of a clear sky, the orders of the teachers that must be followed unconditionally are heard. A man in a military uniform declares that a boy needs to cut his hair because he does not follow the rules. The outraged student defends his appearance and says that others also have long hair. Some students wonder if they will also have to cut their hair, which causes some girls to get hysterical. While the girls decide to defend their right to have long hair, the protagonist sees that the girl Hux escapes and decides that he needs to show who the real leader is. He calls the teacher and asks him what he is doing. This immediately causes a reaction from the military instructor. The protagonist keeps his hands in his pockets while his classmates look at him disconcerted. Chen introduces himself and says that he is a second-year public administration student. The teacher still holds the scissors in his hands, but Chen asks him to keep them so that there are no problems. The teacher looks at him with a terrifying look and says that long hair is not allowed in military training, which absolutely scares everyone. A boy responds outraged that no one will tell him what to do with his hair, but Chen asks him to shut up and explains to him that the instructor was only invited to training and nothing else. He asks the instructor what his boss would think if he saw him with the scissors. The instructor keeps silent and Chen thinks that the guy is too afraid of the authorities to object. He asks if the students cannot have long hair and asks to see the rule. The young man says that if there is really a rule, he will be the first to shave his head. The instructor is speechless and confused, not knowing what to say in response to the student. After a break, the protagonist suggests wearing hats so that the hair does not bother them and does not distract them during class. The instructor accepts the option. The protagonist approaches the boy who is arguing with the instructor and tells him to apologize. The boy begins to get angry and says that he has no reason to apologize. The protagonist insists and the boy quickly obeys. Jackie awkwardly approaches the instructor without looking him in the eye and apologizes. The teacher closes his eyes and clears his throat uncomfortably, thinking about something, and then begins to form a group. The girls appreciate the protagonist's courage and some are even interested in him. Huck takes Yu's hand and begins to push her out of the stadium. The protagonist asks his classmates to form a line, encouraging them. The instructor calls the protagonist by his name and last name, then informs him that the young man smoked, and therefore, broke the rules, so he must run 10 laps. The protagonist gets more serious than a cloud, and one of his classmates laughs at this situation. Chen says that one of his classmates also smokes, so he must run 5 laps. The instructor decides to punish both, so both are forced to run 10 laps. After a while, they are already incredibly tired of running, but one of Chen's friends praises him for arguing with the instructor. The protagonist gets angry and says that it was Jackie's fault for not being able to remove his hair. Jackie tries to mend the situation with the protagonist and offers him his help at any time, just like a dinner. At that moment, he decides to give ice cream to his classmates, and they thank him. The girls eat ice cream and argue about who wants to become the principal, and that is why he bribes people in this way. One of the girls says that the protagonist seems the best option, but another says that it will be difficult to deal with him. One of the girls, without thinking twice, says to vote for whoever they want. The protagonist understands that it is difficult for the girls to vote for him. He looks at the instructor and the teacher, who are at a distance, and discuss something between them. The protagonist decides that he will follow his own path to achieve what he wants, using more influential and important people for this. At that moment, the teacher asks the instructor to notify him immediately of any problem, and offers him a dinner as an apology. The teacher sighs deeply, clearly not expecting a situation like this with the instructor. The protagonist's voice takes him out of his thoughts when he offers him a cigarette. The teacher takes the cigarette and asks Chen about the conflict. The protagonist confirms that the conflict has been resolved and the teacher praises him for the initiative, but he does not have time to finish talking because his phone starts to ring. The protagonist listens attentively to the conversation and understands that the teacher has personal problems and is overloaded with work. The voice on the phone shouts to the teacher that he must go to help, otherwise he may never return. The teacher looks at the phone in shock, and the protagonist asks if his wife called him, to which he says that he can take the teacher's daughter, although the man has doubts. The protagonist insists on his help, but the teacher fears that he does not know how to get there. Shen assures that he knows the city and has relatives there. After thinking for a while, the teacher asks him if the protagonist knows where the gold infant garden is. Shen immediately names the necessary route and even describes the area. The man asks him if he lives nearby and the protagonist says that he made assumptions. Then he asks the teacher to get in touch with the teacher from the infant garden and also tells him that he will show his student ID to verify his identity. The teacher gives the phone to the protagonist and tells him that the meeting will be at the latest at 7. Chen takes the phone in his hands and says with confidence that the teacher can count on him. Then the young man directs his gaze towards the crowd of students. He looks at Hug, who is talking to other girls, and says to himself that sometimes it is worth resorting to other means to achieve the goal. The young man arrives near the infant garden and you can see many parents taking their children home. The protagonist introduces himself and says that he came to pick up the teacher's daughter. The teacher suspects Chen and asks to call the teacher to confirm everything. She calls and asks him if it is true that his student should pick up his daughter. The teacher confirms it and the teacher looks at the protagonist and tells him that he will ask for the student's ID number. Then he moves away and continues to listen to what the teacher is telling him. The teacher warns that Chen must give the number, to which he replies that it is not a problem, and says all the numbers. The teacher confirms the authenticity of the number and ends the conversation with the girl's father. She apologizes for her suspicion, but the protagonist says there is nothing wrong with that. The teacher explains to the girl that the student came to pick her up and will take her with his father. Shen asks the girl to accompany him and crouches to be at his height. Then he asks the girl to say goodbye to the teacher, which he does. After a while, they go to a restaurant to have lunch and relax. He encourages the girl to eat more and asks her some questions. The girl eats a hamburger with pleasure and agrees to answer everything they ask her. Shen asks her if she knows the teacher's number, and the girl says no. The young man asks him a question about the code to pick up things, but the girl does not know exactly what it is. There is an uncomfortable pause between them, and Chen shyly smiles at the girl, then says that it is time to go home, because the girl has already eaten too much, but the little one asks him to stay a little longer. That night, the protagonist tells the teacher that his daughter is already asleep. The teacher's wife thinks of the protagonist, and he himself holds his daughter asleep in his arms. Shen says it is not necessary to thank him. The wife gives the young man fruits as a thank you and invites him to dinner. The teacher offers to accompany the protagonist to the bus stop. Shen smiles and thanks him for the fruits and for the kindness shown. Near the entrance to the university, you can see many students doing their things and sitting on a bench. Shen sits on the bench and smokes. The fruits donated are in a bag on the bench. The protagonist sees Zhou approaching him and says it's time to sleep. The girl's gaze is attracted by the fruits in the bank bag. Zhou is happy with the fruits and asks him where he bought them. The protagonist says he bought them in a nearby store. The girl listens carefully and is a little surprised by what the protagonist said. She settles her hair and asks him if he called her just to give her the fruits. The protagonist says that those fruits are expensive and asks her not to spend so much money. The girl wants to say something, but she is interrupted by someone who calls her. She turns around and sees a boy with glasses who says he did not expect to find her there. Everyone greets him, and Zhou comments that he heard that he works at the Institute of Geology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The boy with glasses shuts up and watches the protagonist carefully. After a while, he breaks the uncomfortable silence and asks him who the boy is. The protagonist replies that he is Zhou's classmate, and then offers the boy a pack of cigarettes, but he rejects him. The boy covers his nose because he clearly does not like the smell of cigarettes. He points to the folder with documents and says that he has to go, so that the teacher can distribute the topics for tomorrow. Zhou explains to Chen that they wanted to take this boy to the Academy of Sciences even before graduating, and one day he came to them looking for a laboratory. The girl looks at the protagonist waiting for some reaction, but he continues to smoke. After a while she still watches him and asks him what happened. The girl looks down and says that he offered to be a laboratory assistant. Shen is surprised and looks away. The girl says she did not accept the job. Shen does not react at all, which terribly irritates the girl, who begins to be outraged that he is smoking again. She tells him that he did not have this habit before, and asks him to think about the future. The young man looks at the cigarette and says that he has plans to be with a certain girl. Zhou blushes and asks if the girl is pretty. The protagonist replies that in all his years he has never met a girl like that. She asks him what will happen if the girl rejects him, and Chen replies that he does not plan to give up. Zhou asks if the protagonist is interested in the opinions of the girl's parents, but he says that he is only interested in the opinion of the girl herself. The girl blushes and her eyes get bigger, clearly embarrassed. Suddenly he runs away and tells the protagonist that he needs time to think. Shen scratches the back of his head, clearly surprised by his sudden change of humor. He stands still and wonders why Zhou needs to think about it, since he is talking about her. The next day, in the classroom, the teacher greets the students and says that enough time has passed for the students to meet and be able to choose a group leader. He claims that the initiative is promoted so that each student can apply. The protagonist's friend asks him to apply himself, since he had already imagined his future. He was the first to apply for his candidacy, and one of the protagonist's friends looks at him with displeasure, thinking that he missed the opportunity. He gets out of his seat, and the teacher says that it is necessary to greet the candidate. The students actively applaud the candidate, who introduces himself and says that many students can meet her because she helped everyone with the application. She says she is excited and will always help her classmates in their studies and other matters, in addition to ensuring a better future for the group. The teacher thanks him for his performance and applause is heard throughout the room, with an especially active applause. The girl returns to her seat, and the teacher thanks her for her speech and hopes that the next candidate adopts the same spirit. Yu looks up and sees the protagonist pass by. Shen notices her gaze and directs his attention to her, smiling slightly. He approaches and smiles confidently while the teacher behind him watches him with interest. A loud applause spreads throughout the audience in honor of the protagonist. His classmates actively support him and wish him good luck. He begins his speech with a little joke, and the teacher notices how he calmed the audience. Then the protagonist promises that he will communicate with each teacher before the exam thus helping the students and fighting for their scholarships and assignments. He mentions that there is a big difference between his university and the school, so they need to discipline themselves. Yu listens to his speech very carefully, especially when he mentions that he will provide them with a good future if they choose him as their leader. Finally, the protagonist says that the students can vote for him if they believe so. The teacher notes that the protagonist has many advantages, such as organizational skills and leadership. The man writes the results of the vote on the blackboard, and the students issue their last vote for Chen. The teacher announces, according to the results of the vote, that with 27 points, the protagonist becomes leader. Chen thanks everyone for the votes, while his classmates praise him. Meanwhile, Huck reminds Yu that men are very unreliable and that he should not forget that. The girl, disappointed, walks through the university campus thinking that everything has lost its meaning. Suddenly the protagonist calls the name of his opponent. Yu, dissatisfied, hopes that he will show him his new position. Shen claims that he wants to invite her to dinner because they need to talk. The girl blushes with shame and incomprehension, then asks him if he decided to become a leader to make her fall in love with him. The protagonist replies that he just wanted to discuss the details of the control with the girl to demonstrate his intentions. He offers to invite the girl to take his friend with her. Yu blushes in front of the protagonist while he says that he invited them to discuss something important. He states that he should not expect blessings from her or his friend. The girl remembers that a few days earlier, he invited the boy to dinner, but ignored the girls. Huck gets up from his seat and goes out to look for food. Yu feels embarrassed sitting in front of the protagonist, but says nothing. The young man carefully observes the girl in front of him, as if remembering the details. He notes for himself his physical qualities and beauty. Finally, Yu decides to look at him, but does not stop smiling for a second. Chen smiles at the visual contact and his smile grows as the girl burns with shame. He returns to the table with a tray full of food and tells the protagonist the cost of the dishes. The meal begins and the girl asks Chen what he wants from her and what is the essence of his date. The protagonist says he has something important to do with her, then declares that he wants to give her the position of leader. Yu, disbelieving, asks if the protagonist will really transfer the position to her, questioning if he is not losing his mind. Chen says it's okay, but he wants to know why she wants to be a leader. He's interested in her motives. The girl, after thinking for a while, replies that she wants to help the students, but the protagonist does not believe her. Yu, strangely, looks away as if he had been caught with his hands on the table. And she says she wants to become a public official in the future, so she needs the experience of a leader, since she is valuable in that type of work. The protagonist understands her motives and understands that she needs a career, while the girl cannot understand why he is asking her those questions and what his true objectives are. He claims that he is only interested in money, and the girl tells him that he has no connections. He replies that thanks to this position, his influence would increase, and the girl points out that this is an excellent tool to achieve his goal. When Chen asks him if his opinions coincide, the girl tries to say no. Meanwhile, Yu eats in silence and listens to his conversation. The protagonist claims that he only needs this position for a year, because he is not interested in being a leader. Yu is very embarrassed by this situation, so he thanks her for the food and wants to leave, but Chen tells him in an arrogant tone that he returns to his place. This causes the girl to panic. Yu begins to actively defend her. The protagonist pushes a plate of peeled shrimp towards the girl and says that he bought it especially for her. The girl is surprised, but Chen asks her to finish and points the plate with her hand. The girl, in panic, says that she does not have to do it for her. Yu observes this whole situation with confusion while the protagonist asks why Yu refuses to eat shrimp. Yu is really disgusted and cannot understand what is happening. Chen looks at her with shame, and a certain resentment is noticeable in his eyes. He leans towards her and takes her hand, in which she holds a cake. Then the young man asks if it really is tasty and asks to try it. The girl is in shock. The protagonist tries the cake and declares that it is not bad, but she still cannot overcome the surprise. With his eyes wide open, stammering and sweating, he tries to say something, but it is interrupted by Yu's scream, who calls the protagonist. He, without understanding the girl's reaction, comments that they still need to cooperate. At that moment, the young woman is furious while her friend burns with shame. The protagonist, slightly tilting his head, reflects mentally. He had always considered Yu the most beautiful of the group, but now he understands who really stands out in beauty. He finds this evaluation strange and incomprehensible. Then the girl comments that few people know how to distinguish true appearance and beauty, so the protagonist must keep everything a secret, since Yu is very shy, and his friend fears that he may come across malicious people. Chen agrees without hesitation, but asks them to stop looking at him so fixedly when they talk about bad people. He answers mockingly that all men think the same way. The protagonist believes that he has taken a strategic step and decides to continue strengthening their relationships. After a brief pause, he proposes an agreement. In the second year, he will renounce the position of leader. However, the girl questions what guarantees he can offer. Chen then presents his plan. During the first year, she will be able to gain everyone's trust, attract attention, and build a good image between teachers and students. She will also be able to join the advisory team, which will help her perform well in exams. She suspects that she only wants to transfer her dirty work to him, but Chen convinces her that everything that belongs to him will eventually also belong to her. Curious, the girl asks what else can she promise him. With a confident smile, Chen responds that they can share the responsibilities. She will take care of the minor issues, while he will take care of the more important ones. Still skeptical, the girl questions what will happen if she rejects the treatment that he is offering her so insistently. Chen responds in a pragmatic way that in that case, he will work even harder so that she does not have the opportunity to lead, since universities rarely change leaders. Faced with this threat, the young woman is speechless. The protagonist then softens his tone, assuring him that he will help her in all matters, but the girl, increasingly angry, says that she is clearly lying and that she would never keep that promise, showing her disdain. Chen, trying to use his charisma, puts his chin on his hand and affirms that he has always been honest and sincere with everyone. Suddenly the girl abruptly gets up from the table and declares that she accepts the deal, then tells her friend Yu that it is time to go. Yu mutters a shy statement and they both leave. The protagonist, satisfied, mentally celebrates his success. His plan worked and managed to convince her. Days later, in a red and white restaurant, the excited voices of the students echo through the hall celebrating the end of military training. The students toast happily while a wide variety of Chinese classic sandwiches fill the table. He encourages Xiao to eat more and suggests that they see each other more often since they study at nearby universities. However, the girl rejects his concern. Meanwhile, the protagonist's best friend sits next to him with an unsatisfied expression. Chen notices it and asks him what's going on. His friend complains that at the University of Finance there are 62 students in his group, but only 2 girls. Surprised, the protagonist opens his eyes and asks how those 2 girls are. His friend, instead of answering, simply keeps drinking in silence as if he did not want to talk about the subject. Understanding his frustration, Chen slaps him on the shoulder and encourages him to keep drinking without worrying. Meanwhile, Xiao says that the university should focus on studies, not on relationships, but Sibo responds by saying that if there are girls available in their specialty, it is better to keep quiet. Then, Gaon calls Chen to sit closer to Xiao and asks him what he thinks of her. In the process of reaching the chopsticks, the protagonist accidentally touches Xiao's shoulder. Without hesitation, he apologizes for the action, leaving Gaon and Xiao completely surprised. Sibo ignores Gaon's unsatisfied screams and mentally says that he wanted to act like Chen without being considered shameless, a moment in which Xiao says that they rarely meet, so they should definitely talk about their achievements. Daeon is thinking of offending Chen, so he asks the young man to start talking about achievements and successes first. The protagonist slowly lights a cigarette, waiting for a dramatic pause before giving his response to his companions. He blows the smoke from the cigarette and looks the other way, saying that he is the leader of the class. Daeon is totally shocked. He clearly did not expect that from the protagonist and looks at him with great surprise. Chen's best friend does not believe him either and screams that the protagonist is definitely lying. Daeon tries to accuse the protagonist of dishonest behavior and says that someone like him could definitely not become the leader of the group. The attention shifts from the protagonist to his best friend and they ask him about his university. He mentions that the infrastructure of his school is not bad, there is even a restaurant there that they could go together in the future. Meanwhile, Chen smokes in silence and thinks that his companions are a lot of sentimental children who pretend to be serious people. Daeon thinks about how he spent the whole night writing about the advantages of his university and hopes that Xiao will transfer to his university, a moment in which they finally ask him about his university. But someone interrupts him and calls the protagonist, who informs him that after the classes begin, they will be offered to carry out various activities and asks what type of payment he will receive as a leader. The protagonist tells his companions that he needs to go to talk about his affairs. Then he approaches and tells him that he receives 50 yens per person, and although he doubts that it is too expensive, he affirms that everything is fine. Chen looks at the girl and asks him to give that 50 to his friend Yu. The girl looks at him with an incomprehensible expression, clearly with the intention of asking him a question, but she takes away the hero's gaze and directs it to her companions who are sitting in a cafe waiting for him. Huck realizes that Zio is looking at Chen and immediately understands what is happening. She looks back at the protagonist and takes the money from him, then says that she hopes the boss feels good. The protagonist is surprised by his behavior and change of mood. Zio gets up from the table, obviously proud, and once again asks the protagonist if he really is a leader. Gaon tries to belittle Chen, saying that leaders are only servants and are far from being members of the student council to which he is about to join. The protagonist does not react to the attempt at offense and says that he thinks exactly the same as Gaon. Sibo asks about his new love interest, and Chen asks him perplexed when he got drunk. His friend continues to whisper to him that in his opinion, the protagonist is trying to get Yu's attention, but the protagonist asks him to remain silent. The companions begin to say goodbye to each other and then head together to a nearby station. At the bottom of the station building there are huge inscriptions made in golden hieroglyphics. The protagonist is about to leave the station when suddenly Zio calls him, clearly wanting to say something. She looks down, as if she were gathering her thoughts before saying what she thinks. After a moment, she turns her gaze towards the protagonist, gathers her confidence and prepares to express her thoughts. She screams loudly to the entire street that appreciates Chen's persistence for her. This attracts the attention of all passers-by. Such a loud statement annoys the young man, who seems to not want to listen anymore. After a while, the protagonist lights another cigarette and sits on a bench, darker than a cloud. The young man feels like a shameless man for letting Zio think that he still has feelings for her. After a few minutes, the young man reaches a street near buildings of several floors. He approaches the office building and says that he is already near the Senton Express. The young man observes the warehouse workers and notes that there is no clothing code here. All the workers dress as they want. He decides to take the reins, so he approaches a worker and hands him a cigarette. Shen asks him if the director of the establishment is there. The boy takes the cigarette and replies that Director John is on the second floor. The protagonist thanks him and goes up to the second floor. He enters the director's office and sees the man sitting on his desk, writing something on a piece of paper. At first he does not notice the young man. When the director directs his attention to the newcomer, he asks him who he is. Shen pulls out a sheet indicating the vacancy and says he saw a job offer in the middle of the day. The director asks where he is from, and the protagonist responds with the name of his university. The boss replies that someone has already come from his university, then warns that the young man can go back to school. The protagonist hears this but does not want to give up. He asks the boss what he needs to do to replace this employee and get his position. The director of the company thinks about the boy's proposal for a few seconds and questions if the boy really wants to go ahead. Shen thinks that the man's reaction is a bad sign, so he says he does not see anything wrong in wanting to take a job because he only wants to make money. The director finds the protagonist a little strange, so he warns him that if he looks at his clothes, he can see that he lives very well, so why does the protagonist need money? The protagonist says that this is not a great office, and that it makes no sense to review the entire process of each employee. The director replies that although the protagonist is very persistent, he cannot simply replace one employee for another. The director comments that the company is doing well now and is delivering many packages. Shen replies that that is why they do not want to change agents. The boss says that if he increases the number of daily references to 100, the young man will get the job. The protagonist thinks it is a good offer and asks the director if he has a presentation card. The boss takes his card and brings it to the protagonist. He takes it from the man's hands, opens the doors and leaves. The director returns to his documents and says that this boy is interesting. Meanwhile, other actions occur in the streets of the city. It is possible to hear voices inviting residents to work at the club. Shen walks down the street and believes that in the future he will have to work with rich people and with many stores, so he thinks that at the university the easiest way to get to know each other is to join some type of club or union. At that moment, the young man is in a long line in the office of the Student Relations Department. One of the students notices the young man and asks him if he came to join the student association. He winks and says that for his group to have a good future, someone needs to join there. Upon hearing this, the girls look at each other and do not know what to say. They shake hands and say that they are going to visit other places because they are friends and it is not good to compete among them. The protagonist says that tomorrow he will pay for his coffee. Then they say goodbye in a friendly way. In the line, a boy notices Chen and is clearly not happy. The protagonist realizes the boy's negative reaction and cannot understand what caused it. The boy walks away without saying anything, continuing with the frown. Soon, Chen receives an invitation from the commission to enter. He enters the office and stands in front of 3 people. The protagonist realizes that the boy who whistled at him is one of the judges in the office. They look at each other and the boy observes the young man with evident hostility. The protagonist introduces himself politely and tells the members of the commission his name, but it is interrupted in the middle of the sentence. The boy who did not like it says that it is not necessary for him to introduce himself, since they only recruit girls. Chen feels unsatisfied for having been silenced and begins to get angry with the selection committee. The girl from the commission whispers to the boy that she does not remember those conditions for the recruitment of the club. He replies that he will explain it to her later. Then he tells Chen that his commission resolves issues related to business and sponsors. So he thinks that the girls are more suitable for this and that Chen should leave and not take charge of the other team. The nearby girl comments that until recently they had chosen a boy, so she is confused to hear that they only accept girls. The protagonist begins to get angry and asks the boy if that is really what everyone needs. The man is surprised by the reaction of the young man and a conflict begins between them. The audience is surprised and begins to closely follow the confusion between the two. The boy from the commission begins to get angry and says that every year first-year students become more difficult to keep in line. The girl next to him asks the young man to calm down, and the protagonist replies that he is completely calm, but wants to talk to the manager. The committee is surprised by this statement. The protagonist approaches the boy and begins to say that this is a strange gender discrimination. The boy replies that the connections are better maintained by the girls. Chen says that the most important thing is the correct performance of the task, not the gender of the worker. He also says that if only girls are needed, then what is this boy doing here? The people around him support Chen and tell the boy to leave. Suddenly a man appears behind them and says that it is time to leave this farce. The protagonist turns around and looks at the newcomer, does not recognize him, and asks him who he is. The man introduces himself as Suyo and says that he is the vice president of the student union. He enters the office and says that if there is a problem, he can call security. The protagonist calmly responds to the vice president that in that case, it is time for him to leave. Surprised, he asks him where he would go. Chen replies that he himself can call the security guard. Su does not know how to respond to such a shame and asks him which group the protagonist belongs to and who his advisor is. Chen replies that he is the leader of the second group and offers to give him his number. The vice president is surprised by such a shame of the first-year student in his speech. Then the girls enter the office and defend the protagonist. The girl from the commission approaches the protagonist and asks him not to fight. He tells her that the interview is over and now he just has to wait for the result. The protagonist calms down and smiles at the girl, saying that in this case there is no need to worry. The boy from the commission begins to complain about the behavior of the protagonist, his arrogance and contempt for the club. Shen replies that there is no clause in the rules that prohibits the entrance of first-year students to the club. The audience stands by the protagonist and says that if he can participate, why do the judges stop him? The vice president says that all responsibility is his and asks the protagonist if he could guarantee sponsorship. Shen questions if the man can always guarantee sponsorship, to which Joey answers affirmatively. The protagonist says that in that case, he can also handle it easily, which causes an indignant reaction from the vice president. The audience stands by the protagonist and says that it is time to give first-year students the opportunity to join without depending on their gender. Sue says that they could use some help from first-year students and that she believes that she can give the protagonist an opportunity to show her worth. So the vice president wants to compare which of them will be able to get more sponsors in total. The girl next door says that Joey has more possibilities because he has experience working in the student ministry for a year. The vice president asks if the protagonist wants to participate. Chen asks, with confidence, that it will happen if he wins and collects more money with the sponsorship. Joey replies that in that case, he could be president of the commission. The protagonist accepts delighted and the boy is surprised by this, because he did not expect such an answer. Shen points out to the people who are close and says that there are many witnesses here, so Joey will not be able to reject his promise. At that moment, the rules are given. At the beginning, a person is randomly selected to calculate the amount of sponsorship. Whoever collects the most sponsors will win. They are asked if everything is clear regarding the rules. The protagonist's rival responds affirmatively. The protagonist is not sure how reliable the one-person random selection system is, but he accepted the conditions. The opponent is assigned the place of a hairdresser and Chen has won a nearby stationery. The opponent begins to move away from them and says with confidence that they will still see who will win here. The rest of the audience watches from afar while the boy communicates with the administration of the hairdresser. Yan tells the hero that the hairdresser opened recently, but the stationery has been running for a long time. Shen tells him not to worry. The protagonist's rival returns and happily says that he has collected 200 sponsorship fees and a 300 yuan coupon. The protagonist is not impressed and throws the cigarette. He moves away from the opponent and walks towards the crowd of students. A girl approaches him and offers him help. She tells him that she will start with him since the young man is only a first-year student. She enters the store and greets the owner, apologizing for bothering him, then begins to explain that the club collects sponsors for the university. The owner, with a sudden and fast movement, hits the table with a book. He says out loud that he already has a lot of debts, and that is why he cannot sponsor anything. The girl says she takes this book every time they ask her for sponsorship. The protagonist thinks it is difficult for people to earn money. The seller shows the book and says that if the students help manage their debts, he can sponsor them. The girl is upset because she is sure that they will not be able to get anything from this man. The club members look at Chen, confident that he will lose the competition. Suddenly the protagonist turns to the owner of the store and tells him that he can help him solve his debts. The seller is surprised by what he heard since he did not expect such an offer from the student. The owner of the store accepts those conditions and Chen says that he will discover everything before the second half of the day. The seller gives him instructions that he must go to the store on the other side of the street, where there is a middle-aged man with a threatening appearance, with a large knife in one hand and a watermelon in the other. The girls are scared by his appearance and even confuse him with a butcher instead of a fruit seller. The rivals are complacent with this reaction of the girls. They think they will be afraid to go there, and therefore, they will lose the competition. The action takes place near a fruit store in the market. Shen is in front of the store of a threatening fruit seller. The seller raises his huge knife over the fruit and makes it seem intimidating. With a strong blow, he cuts the watermelon in 2 equal parts with a loud sound. Shen's friends don't like this, but the protagonist doesn't react, and his friends begin to convince him that the debt is not so important. They believe that this seller is not very prone to communicate. The protagonist tells them that if they are afraid, he can go alone. They are surprised by this statement. The protagonist's rival asks the vice president if he should win, but the man does not answer. The protagonist approaches the store owner. The man looks at him while cleaning the knife with a cloth, then asks the protagonist and the 2 friends who are behind him what they need. Chen smiles politely and tells the owner that he does not need the fruit, that what he needs is money. Upon hearing this, the seller looks at him with an ugly face, then gives another strong blow and cuts the watermelon into 4 parts. A loud bang is heard when the knife hits the wood. The owner looks at them and asks again what kind of money they are talking about. The juice of the watermelon on his knife looks like something else, which makes it look even more threatening. Chen's friends are even more scared of this man, but despite this, the protagonist remains calm. He takes a small piece of watermelon from the seller's table and begins to eat it. Chen, calm and confident, tells the man who came from the office supply store on the other side of the street. He says that the guy owes the store owner 3,500 and has not paid it yet. The store owner is surprised by the value and shame of the protagonist. It seems strange to him that he is not afraid, so he asks him when he hired the protagonist. Chen replies that should not worry him and again asks about the money. The seller says he does not owe 35,000. Shen replies that is what he heard. Then the seller turns his attention to the protagonist's friends and asks them what kind of people they are. The protagonist smiles and says that they are his classmates, and that if he does not pay the debt, they will have to take the necessary amount of fruit from him. The owner gets angry when he hears such a threat and shouts at Chen, asking him how he dares to do that. Then the man goes to the back room and takes a piece of paper that shows that he only owes 25,000 to the store owner of office supplies. The protagonist agrees with the amount mentioned, and then the seller tells him to return the receipt since he apparently heard wrong and that the seller only owes 25,000. The protagonist says that now he has material evidence of the debt and asks the store owner to pay him. The man shouts at him, and the rest of the students support the protagonist, telling the man to pay the debt. The man begins to shout at him and asks what will happen if he does not pay his debt. A policeman approaches to see the crowd gathered around the store, trying to understand why so many people have gathered there. The policeman goes to the store owner and tells him that he needs to intervene with the rest of the trade and disperse the crowd. The seller says that everything will be solved and gets even more irritated with the protagonist, but Chen only stays there, smiling politely. The protagonist and his friends arrive at the store of office supplies and deliver the necessary amount to the store owner. The owner says that he never thought that the money would return to him and thanks Chen and his friends. He stretches out his hand to take the money, but the protagonist stops him. The owner asks what the problem is and the protagonist responds that according to the contract, that money belongs to him, since he recovered it from the debt. The owner complains that the amount is too much and only offers 500 yuan. The students say that they had agreed on something different and that the owner has to accept, although rebuking, what they say. Finally, the protagonist receives the money from the sponsorship. He happily looks at his rivals in the competition and hands the money to the girl, telling her that he received 500 yuan from the owner. She is surprised by this, and the rivals stay behind them, observing what is happening with dissatisfied faces. The protagonist looks at them with confidence and asks the girl what that was. She looks at him with displeasure for a few seconds, but says nothing and takes the money out of her hand. Voices are heard everywhere congratulating the protagonist for his victory. A while later, the members of the club begin to leave, clearly upset by what just happened. The students scream behind them that according to the plan, they must leave the president's chair. Shen believes that they will not do it and tells his friends that they will go for a drink. The friends are happy about this and the rivals leave the building. The students are outraged that the members of the club have ignored their promise. They believe that they will not give up. The protagonist looks at the man and thinks that the president cannot afford to lose authority over the other students. It was already night and the protagonist was in the building with the rest of the students. They were playing cards, and one of them shouted that he had gathered 4 kings, and that the victory was his. Yang slaps the protagonist, who complains that Yang attacked him again in a card game. Then another student shouts the news that Jackie and Sue fought each other. Yang and the protagonist are surprised. Yang says that Sue is not that kind of person. The protagonist asks where are those 2 people who fought in the bedroom. After a while, a dense crowd is near them, and they discuss what is happening. They think that the 2 boys are drinking. Yang and Chen approach the crowd. The young man does not like what is happening or the fact that the problems never end. Then the students hear a voice near them. One of the teachers wants to go through the crowd and one of the boys who fought is covered in scratches and bruises. Suddenly the protagonist enters the room, turns to Professor Gaon, and tells him that he was about to meet him. The teacher looks at them severely and asks the protagonist if he knows what happened there. The protagonist looks at the boys who fought and begins to think about the reasons for the fight. He assumes that Sue will invent something to involve him in the fight, since it is a confrontation between 2 members of the club and the protagonist could be the culprit, which could lead to his expulsion. Shen does not know what to do and believes that the current situation could greatly damage his reputation. He thinks that this fight and its solution are a complex and difficult task. The teacher tells the protagonist to stop keeping silent and to say what he knows about what happened. Jackie, doubtful, begins to try to blame himself, but his phrases are interrupted. The protagonist does not allow him to finish and claims that he knows what happened there, although this is not true. Jackie is very surprised by this. The teacher says that the leader should not participate in such fights and asks him to write an explanatory note. Shen promises to do so that same afternoon. The teacher says that after the explanation, he must apologize to Sue, and shortly after he will be punished for what happened. The young man apologizes to Sue, and the man frowns when he sees Chen. The doctor approaches Sue and begins to check him by touching his wounds and asking where it hurts. The teachers look at each other. The doctor states that everything is fine, and that it is not necessary to prescribe medicines or treatment. They begin to disperse. The curious students group up and say that it is time to go to their rooms to sleep. The protagonist tells Jackie to stop the fight and return to his room. The boy seems annoyed and accepts, turning to leave. At that moment, there are only 2 people left in the room, the protagonist and Sue. There is tension in the environment. Sue begins the conversation first. She tells the protagonist to stop pretending to be a kind person. Shen at first does not respond, but then turns to the boy and tells him that he only did it because he is a university student, otherwise he would not have helped him, even if the boy's life depended on him. Sue is surprised by what she hears, then Shen turns around and begins to leave the room with his hands in his pockets. The students in the corridor look at him with curiosity. Jackie, seeing him, begins to apologize. The boy tells him that he did not want things to be like that between them. The protagonist, instead of responding, hits him hard on the leg and Jackie falls to the ground. The friends ask if Jackie is okay and he replies that he deserved the blow. The doubtful students reassure the boy and tell him that the leader will forgive him. Jackie simply sits in silence, clearly very upset by what happened. Meanwhile, the teachers communicate on the street. One of them says that he did not expect Chen to assume the blame for something he did not do. The other agrees and says that the leader is very servile. Don talks about the student council. He believes that the leader of his class is too impulsive. The teacher says that Sue is smart and decided to take a chance this time to show that no one else deserves her position. Dawn smokes a cigarette on the street and agrees with the teacher's words, but wonders what will happen to her student. The other replies that he does not want to worry him, so he does not say anything to him. Meanwhile, the students gather in the place to discuss today's incident. The protagonist is sitting in a chair, turning his back on the others and saying nothing. Jackie apologizes to him and tells him that he lost his nerves over the drink. Other students support him and say that he has already admitted his guilt. The protagonist gives him a cigarette and Jackie, seeing him, is happy. He takes the cigarette from the protagonist's hands and starts talking, but it is interrupted by Chen, who says that the incident was not useless. The students are surprised by this. He smokes and tells the others that after today, the boy will no longer be able to be vice minister. The next day, the action takes place in a college club. The members meet in the office and invite Chen. Then they ask him if he is ready to take the place of vice president of public relations of the club. The protagonist responds positively, says that he will not let them down and will be up to his expectations. They say that after his recent resignation, there was a vacancy and they decided to accept the protagonist. They inform him that he will take over after the vacation period is over. Chen thanks them, but he is not happy with what is happening, says nothing and begins to leave the office. Then he turns to the rest of the members of the club and says that the protagonist is not as simple as it seems at first glance. Then he adds that they will regret having accepted Chen for the vacation. The protagonist asks if the boy wants to say something more about him. The man says he does not want to say anything else and warns that they will meet again. The protagonist begins to leave the club's office. After a while, the boy of the club thinks it is a form of thanks. The girl says she was invited to support the candidate of the protagonist, and that she cannot disappoint him. Some events take place on October 1 during a national holiday. There is a crowd of students on the street, and the protagonist says that the girl's father should not have met him. Zio responds that in that case, he will have to take the bus. They hear the driver say that it is time to get going. The car has 7 seats and belongs to Zio's father. Daeon says Chen needs to act maturely, considering his age. Chen is tired of it. The driver says they get in the car and put their luggage and belongings in the back. Zio sits in the passenger seat and there is only an empty seat next to her. Daeon is happy to be able to sit next to her, opens the door and gets ready to get in the car, but the protagonist tells him to let him pass because he wants to sit in the back seat of the car. Daeon lets him pass and thinks that everything is going well, so he looks at the hero and sees that he did not sit in the back seat, but next to the girl. Daeon asks him if the young man did not want to sit in the back, but Chen replies that he changed his mind. Then the student is called and told to get in the car. He is upset about the protagonist's mistake, but finally sits inside the car, which is being prepared to head. Daeon complains about the protagonist's behavior, saying that he will never take his word for it. At that moment, the driver instructs the students to put on their seat belts. Daeon, in the back seat, tries to start a conversation with the girl. He asks her what club she joined. Zio says he still doesn't know where to go because he has many options in front of her. Daeon begins to show off and says that he joined the advertising club and that now he does not have to worry about anything. Cebu comments that he wanted to join the club but was not accepted. The girl replies that she would like to join the student council. Then they ask him about Chen's club. The protagonist replies that he is the vice president of public relations of the student union. They reply that he is already the leader of his group at the university and wonder where else he could try. Daeon does not believe that the protagonist has become vice president of the student council. The driver listens to the conversation and thinks that he is sure that the protagonist has really taken the position, judging by his experience with him. Suddenly Daeon begins to say that a first-year student could not take such a position, that it would have to be too excellent. He asks Chen's opinion, but he ignores the question and says that he does not want to talk about that nonsense. After a while, the car stops on the street. The sound of the brakes is heard and everyone gets out of the car. The driver says that this is where they say goodbye, since he still has matters to solve. Then the car starts and moves away from them. The girl says she still has a lot of luggage. Daeon offers to help her carry it. She realizes that something is not right with the protagonist and asks him if he can help her. The protagonist looks at her without any visible reaction. Daeon, hearing this, says that he can help the girl carry the bags himself, but Sibo stops him. The boy is disgusted that he cannot stay with the girl and help her. This opportunity was for the protagonist. The protagonist thinks that he could have arrived earlier so as not to carry the things of others, but Sibo wanted to save on the train ticket and that is why he came with the girl. After a while, he is carrying Zio's bags. She runs ahead and starts eating a candy on a stick, then offers it to the protagonist, but he refuses. Shortly after, he decides to eat and the girl approaches, handing the candy directly to his mouth. This does not take him by surprise, but he begins to eat. For a while they do not say anything. She begins to tell something about what happened recently, but it is interrupted. The protagonist looks deeply at the crowd and sees that his father is there. The man watches him perplexed by the shameful scene between Chen and the girl. The girl has not noticed it yet, and the protagonist begins to think about how to get out of this situation. In the afternoon, the protagonist arrives at the billiard club to spend the time and relax. He stands near the table with a cue in his hands. The friend says that he did not expect to find such great places in the city. Sibo then notices two attractive girls climbing the stairs next to them. They talk about yesterday, when the protagonist saw his father. Shen comments that his father remains silent. He also says that his father knows what happened. They continue to play billiard, and the protagonist, after a blow, says that it is his turn to hit. Sibo notices that the nearby girls are dressed very lightly and asks the protagonist if they are not cold with that temperature. The protagonist assumes that they are already used to it, so he sits in a nearby chair and takes out a cigarette, starting to smoke, releasing clouds of smoke from his mouth. While he smokes, one of the girls approaches him and invites him to have a drink with her. The protagonist points to Sibo and tells him to better go with him, because he does not have a girlfriend, which the girl listens to his advice and approaches Sibo, asking him how old he is. Sibo begins to flirt. The night falls on the street and the moon is visible in the sky. They leave the club and the friend begins to complain that they only left at 10 at night. Shen takes a cigarette and starts smoking. The protagonist begins to talk about what he did on campus, but suddenly he stands still. The friend begins to ask what he was doing on campus, but the protagonist does not answer him. Both notice someone next to him and look in his direction. They shut up together. There are two girls there who look at them with surprise. The friend invites the protagonist to run away from there, but he replies that it is too late to escape and they have already seen them. The protagonist thinks that since he and Zio were not in a relationship, there is nothing wrong with going to a club. The young man smiles, saying that the party is over and that his house is in the other direction. Zio gets angry and says that he said he was going to go to his grandmother's house. The protagonist does not know how to respond and only looks at the girl. Zio's friend mentions that they talked and that the girl wanted to go out with the protagonist. Zio interrupts his friend and crouches, putting the glass he was holding on the floor. He tells his friend to leave and they start walking in silence. The friend begins to say that a new drink recently appeared in the store and that Zio bought it for him. The woman blames him for the places he visits and calls him a shameless man. The protagonist does not understand that he is wrong with this and thinks that he did nothing wrong. The protagonist's friend tells him to talk to the girl. Shen feels bad about what happened and Sibo says that he could lose his girlfriend this way. The fruit drink that Zio left spills on the floor. A little later, the protagonist decides to call Zio's father. He goes to the public phone and dials his number. The father answers the phone and Shen tells him to give the phone to Zio. The father looks at the door of the girl's room but she does not answer the call. Then, his father assumes that she is already asleep and tells Chen that the girl is resting and that she should call her tomorrow. Chen puts the phone back in silence and returns home. The next morning, he starts calling Zio's house again and his father answers the phone. The young man asks him to give the phone to the girl, but the father tells him that she left home a while ago. A little later, he calls the same place again. The father answers again and asks him who is calling. Zio is sitting next to him on the sofa, but does not answer his father's phone. The protagonist says he wants to talk to the girl, but they tell him that she has not returned home yet, although this is not true. Chen tells the girl's father to tell him that he is returning to the university today. The father whispers to the girl that the protagonist is returning today, but she does not react to this and is still sitting with a frown on the sofa. Zio ignores all attempts to contact his father. He is upset about this and looks at her, not knowing what to say in this situation. He asks the girl what was the reason for the fight between them and what happened the day before. She does not respond and continues to look at the ground in silence. It is evident that she is upset about what is happening. Shen hangs up the phone and starts leaving there. He does not know what to do with his relationship with Zio. The father says that the mother will return soon, and he thinks she will ask if he sees his daughter's condition. Instead of answering, the girl gets up from the sofa and says she is going to take a shower. The father decides to ask if she and Chen are in love with each other. She responds aggressively and sharply that they are not in love, that they have never been. The protagonist is already at home, packing his things to return to the university. The mother complains that she recently raised her son, but now he leaves without mercy. The protagonist replies that he cannot do anything about it, since he is a leader. The mother takes money and gives it to him, but the young man tells her that he does not need money. She asks him how it is possible that he does not need it, and Chen responds that he recently earned 2,500. Then he begins to leave the house, telling his parents to take care of their health and not to argue with each other. The mother watches him without knowing what to say. He closes the door behind him, leaving his parents alone. The mother asks her husband if they have gotten old. The father asks her why she thinks that, and she replies that it seems that Chen now has his own world, in which he does not take money, and does not need them at all. The father thinks this is a good thing because that way they will worry less about him. But the mother thinks this is wrong and asks him if the companions of her husband have daughters of the appropriate age for Chen. The father remembers seeing his son and the girl Zio on the street as a couple. He tells his wife that probably his companions do have daughters of the right age. The man continues to remember the scene between Chen and the girl. Meanwhile, outside there is a heavy rain and the sky is covered with clouds and thunder. The protagonist walks without umbrellas due to the flood. The young man thinks how unfortunate it was that it rained just after leaving his parents' house. The protagonist sees in the distance a girl who is standing under the rain and gets wet. He recognizes her and the girl also does not see. Yu is surprised to see him there, and Chen begins to walk towards her. As he walks, he takes an umbrella out of his backpack. Yu feels ashamed of him and smiles a little because he remembers the last meeting, which was very strange. The girl remembers the embarrassing situation and feels very strange in his presence. Chen looks at her, which makes her feel even more uncomfortable. Yu begins to leave, but he stops her, telling her to wait. The protagonist approaches, saying that he is not going to eat her and that there is no reason to run away from him. They look at each other and the atmosphere is very uncomfortable. At that moment, the young man invites her to dinner together that night. The girl does not respond and he says they are classmates. He also tells her that he does not feel very well today. Yu asks what he wants to eat, and the protagonist says that there is a new dish in the cafeteria. When they ask him for the price, he replies that it costs 50 yuan. Then they decide to walk to the albergue, and the girl begins to insist that the boy walk faster. They enter the rain and she begins to run quickly. The protagonist continues to walk calmly and she disappears from his sight, saying that he is going to change. She carries the young man's umbrella and he asks her where his is. Then Yu returns and replies that he gave it to Hook so that he would not get wet. Shen is surprised and asks the girl if she herself does not need it so as not to get wet. She says that everything is fine, and the young man thinks that this girl is very innocent. Then they start walking together. Chen tells her to stay under the umbrella so as not to get wet. Finally, after a few minutes of walking, they arrive at the cafeteria. They order shrimp and lamb for 2 people, which costs a total of 53 yuan. The girl hands the money to the cashier, and then they begin to look for a place in the living room to sit. Shen asks her if she went to the bedroom to get money, and she says yes. He looks at her perplexed, but says nothing. They sit at the table and begin to silently eat their portions with chopsticks. The protagonist eats and watches the girl, asking her if she is hungry. He asks her this because she only holds the food with the chopsticks and does nothing else. His face darkens, and he gets upset when he hears her question. Yu looks sad, and Chen says that this dish costs more than the price of the accommodation and asks if she is not going to eat it. She says she still has 100 yuan saved. In addition to that, she will earn some money by ordering books at the library. She says she can save money and eat at a cafe. Shen asks her if she blames her for spending her money on food, and she replies that she does not. The young man looks at her curiously, but does not say anything directly. After a while, the protagonist gathers his courage and tells him that in that case, he must become his girlfriend. This surprises her, and the girl ends up tossing her rice plate. There is an uncomfortable silence between them. Yu begins to feel embarrassed and blushes. She does not know how to respond to such a rare proposal. Then she says she only ate a few bites and asks the protagonist not to force her to eat. The protagonist is surprised by her reaction, but accepts and changes the topic of conversation to something different. She looks at the rice scattered on the table and says that she does not like to force people to do things. Yu remembers how Hook convinced her that Chen would take the lead. Then her friend advises her to avoid it if she does not like it. Yu looks at the protagonist, but finds nothing to say. She is very embarrassed by what is happening in the dining room, so the girl decides that it is time to leave. The protagonist accepts, since he has also eaten, and tells him that he needs to take an umbrella, since the cafeteria is near his bedroom. He also tells her to take the rest of the cafeteria food home. He moves away from her. Yu looks at the protagonist with uncertainty, but says nothing. Then the girl looks down and notices something on the table next to her. It turns out to be a blank envelope that the protagonist did not take. She says she did not take the envelope, but Chen had already left the room. Yu takes the envelope with her hands and looks at it. The next day, the protagonist tells the teacher that when he was visiting his parents, he brought 2 geese to cook. The teacher thanks him and says he wants to invite him. Chen replies that the teacher is too kind. Go tells his daughter that the protagonist is there. The girl jumps on her arms and says that he has finally arrived. Chen replies that he came here to see her. She takes his hand and says that he knows what the pig's coat means. Go does not understand what he is talking about. The protagonist thinks that next time he needs to give the girl something and says loudly that he should tell everyone what he discovered. Suddenly the woman's voice is heard from the kitchen saying that the food is ready and that dinner can begin. The protagonist turns to the teacher and says that he will go to the kitchen first. Go tells the protagonist that there is a girl in his room named Yu, then asks him if he knows her. The protagonist confirms and the teacher begins to talk about her, saying that she has family problems and that she asked for help to get a scholarship and enter the university. It turns out that Yu helped her, but now she has problems. The teacher asks the protagonist if he can take care of this matter. Shen did not respond to the teacher and only showed a surprised expression on his face. The teacher asked him if he had any questions and the protagonist replied that he did not have questions. Other events take place on October 8 in the university building. Chen sits with his friends in class and Ong complains about how difficult it is to return after vacation. Chen says that he is also tired. Suddenly Yu appears and asks him to talk to him. She keeps him away from the rest of the students so that his conversation is not heard by anyone, then takes out a blank envelope from his pocket and shows it to the protagonist. Angry, she asks him what that means. The protagonist looks at the envelope and thinks about how the letter ended up in his possession. He says that those things should not be discussed here, because the students may not understand everything well. Huck says that Yu asked him to return that letter. The protagonist asks if Yu opened the envelope. Huck replies that Yu did not open it, but she did. The protagonist asks what he wants from him since he opened a letter that was not for her. Huck says he does not need to chase Yu and warns him that there are other girls he can fall in love with. The protagonist asks if he caused any harm to Yu. The girl says that he gave her 500 yens and that he could offend her if he opened the envelope. The protagonist raises his hand and says that in any case, he does not want to hurt Yu. The girl does not believe his words, but then begins to think that everyone believes and trusts him, so this means that he behaves decently. Suddenly the young man lights a cigarette and starts smoking. The girl walks away from the boy. He reveals that he is not in love with anyone, and then she says that he knows that Huck is single and has some friends to introduce him to. Huck gets angry with him and is about to leave, but halfway he turns around and looks at him. The girl says that the girls feel disconnected from the boys, they often feel that they need to get closer to them. Chen thinks that this is a good proposal, so the staff will become friendlier and will be able to communicate with Yu. He asks her what she is thinking. She says they could meet in a group and eat somewhere. Chen replies that this is too old-fashioned. He believes that everyone needs to unite in some way, but in another way. The girl asks if he invented something, and he replies that he will tell her when he returns to the dormitory. She turns around and says she's leaving. He interrupts her and asks her to wait a little longer. Chen turns off the cigarette and says that there is one more topic he wants to discuss with her. Huck asks what it is. The young man replies that she asked for financial support for Yu, but did not mention the problems with the girl's approval. Huck stutters, and the protagonist says that they had already agreed that she would contact him when problems arose that he could not solve. He says that she has her own motivation and sense of dignity, but sometimes they need to be colder, and he says that he can solve it and that he will look for the commission again to try to get help. The protagonist says that he will go with her to deal with this situation, and she agrees. Then Huck meets Yu, and tells him that the teacher told him everything about the protagonist, and that now he will take care of the problem. She feels embarrassed by this and does not know what to say. Suddenly the girl notices a man at the door turns out to be the protagonist. He looks at her directly, which makes her feel even more embarrassed. She puts her head on the table and hides her face. After a while, they arrive at the teacher's room. Huck greets the teacher and Yu, who hides behind his friend. The protagonist observes the teacher's face and recognizes him as Yu Ying. The man tells the girls that they came in vain, since they still have to wait for the approval of the request. He says that the data provided is not enough. Huck asks how long the whole process will take. Ping replies that he does not know, and that they will let them know when he is ready. The girl gets angry and says that he sent the documents before the holidays began and asks why he is not ready yet. He replies that they have certain financial rules and that they should understand it. The three get up and look at the teacher. Ping shuts up and does not look at them. The girl thinks that only Chen can solve the problem, so she tells the teacher that he must understand the situation and that Yu constantly saves on food. Huck says that Yu always works late at the library and that he is going to get a second job at the cafeteria to pay for the food. She gets angry with him and tells him that they should consider these things in relation to the students. The teacher keeps silent and does not pay attention to the words of the angry girl. He realizes that he has no reaction to his words, so she gets even more angry and can hardly contain herself. The girl cannot stand it anymore and hits the table hard, asking what kind of teacher he is. The teacher opens a shelf on the desk and takes out a small object, gives the official seal and says that now the students have all the responsibility of this situation. The protagonist grabs the girl and tells her not to stop helping Yu. The protagonist tells the teacher that it is time for everyone to calm down a bit and get together. He drags the angry girl out of the room, ignoring her protest. They go out into the street in front of the building. The young man asks her if she has already calmed down. She complains that Yu fulfilled all the conditions and never received help. Yu herself says that they no longer have to go there, assures that everything is fine and that it can be handled without financial support for the students. Chen sits on the steps of a building and sighs loudly. He goes to Huck and asks for Yu's documents. The girl asks if she can handle it. The protagonist replies that he does not know if the idea will work, but he believes that at least it is worth trying. Huck believes that none of that will come out, since the teacher does not even want to try to understand the situation. Chen believes that the problem is another. At that moment, he gets up from the steps and walks back towards the building. The protagonist returns to Professor Ping's office. He says his name and apologizes for the girl's behavior, saying that he did not understand the situation. Ping agrees with him but remains silent. Chen notices something nearby in the office that catches his attention, so the young man goes to the closet and begins to clean and put things in order. The director watches this, but says nothing. Chen places the books in their place and carefully organizes them in the shelf. Then he takes a broom and begins to sweep the dust and debris on the floor of the office. The director wants to stop him, but the protagonist only smiles politely. Then he takes a rag and begins to clean the floor. Ping works in silence all this time, then makes hot coffee for the director while he fills out the papers on his desk. During the time that Chen is doing the homework, the morning passes and noon arrives. The director gets up from the table and says that he will go to eat during the break. The protagonist agrees, and together with him, he leaves the office towards the corridor. After a short time, the protagonist returns to the director's office. He greets him, and Ping asks him if he should not go to class. The protagonist replies that he does not have class now in the afternoon. The director tells him that he has cleaned well and that he can return to the bedroom, but Chen replies that he only washed the floor and that he did not have time to clean the closet. The director thinks mentally that it does not matter how long the young man spends trying to get help for Yu. It is already getting dark and it is 5:30. The protagonist and the director are still in the office. The director tells the protagonist that he has already cleaned the floor in the closet and that now there is no need for him to return. The next day, Chen replies that he is not finished yet and that he only removed what was outside the closet, but he has not cleaned inside. The next morning, the protagonist continues to clean the director's office and they do not communicate. On the third day, the situation is repeated and once again, they do not speak. On the fourth day, the protagonist continues to clean. Finally, the director turns to him and asks his name. Shen is cleaning the closet at that moment and introduces himself saying that he is the leader of his group. The boy invites him to smoke and he accepts. The boy lights his cigarette and they start smoking together. The boys stay next to each other and only release smoke clouds. Ping asks if things are really that bad for Yu economically. The protagonist replies that his parents left early and she lived with her grandmother. He says that Yu saves everything he can on food and that he only spends 50 yuan during the month. The man listens to Chen and puts the cigarette in the ashtray, saying that now he understands the situation of the girl. The protagonist continues to smoke and no longer responds. The events continue in the director's office. The protagonist tells the director that he sees documents here that can encourage students to open their own business. The director replies that the university, in reality, has very few resources for this and all they can do for the students is free the classrooms. Ping says that now people open their own businesses to earn advertising. Then the man remembers something and starts looking in the shelf on his desk. He takes the documents and says that Chen does not need to come tomorrow. Then he tells him to give them to Yu and to complete the documents. The protagonist is surprised and the director says that he spoke to Gao and confirmed the financial situation of the girl. According to him, the documents should be presented next week. Shen asks if the documents from the city of Wu are necessary, and the director replies that they are not very important. The boy begins to read the documents, which are a request to request financial help for low-income students. The protagonist is satisfied that he has achieved it and that he can help the girl. The protagonist arrives at the room where his friends meet. They chat about who of them helped him this week. The three of them recently helped him, and the protagonist agrees that their help is extremely important to him. The students support him, and the protagonist says that they must organize events for the boys and girls of the group. The students love the idea and are excited about the opportunity to work on this project. Chen says that Hawk invited them to dinner and drink. His friends think it's a good idea, but Chen says he didn't approve that option, and the students, perplexed, ask why. He argues that they are still too young for such entertainment events. Hearing this, the boys ask if the protagonist has a better idea. Shen suggests going to the Student Activities Center and buying 54 movie tickets. One of his friends dreams of sitting next to Yanan. Suddenly Yu reminds the protagonist that the cigarette ran out, so he says that without cigarettes he will not be able to think. Then the young man offers to go buy it. The protagonist asks him not to buy cheap cigarettes. The man replies that he does not worry and that he will buy the right ones for him. After a while, the protagonist approaches Yu, who is sitting at the table reading something in a book. She notices it, but she is very shy. The protagonist asks him if he missed him while he was away in the previous days. Yu does not respond to this, and he says he needs help to get up to date with his studies since he was absent. Then he asks her if she heard him. She shyly and in doubt answers yes. Suddenly a girl enters and begins to scream at the protagonist, telling him not to buy Yu's father. The protagonist looks and says that Yu arrived at the right time. He says he has a form to help low-income students and needs help to fill it. The girl is happy to see the document and is surprised that the secretary has still helped the protagonist to obtain approval. Yu hesitates in thanking the protagonist for the favor, but the young man tells her that when they have time, they must sleep together. She gets angry and feels embarrassed. Yu filled the request and asked the protagonist when the funds would arrive. He says there is still no way to know. Then he says that to join the team it is necessary to organize a joint screening of movies. He comments that he intends to buy 54 tickets for a youth activity. The young man also mentions that the girls and boys will do raffles to determine who sits with whom. He says that this method can divide people into small groups and bring them together. In addition, the boy suggests that this could lead to the development of a romantic relationship. At that moment, the boy begins to leave and the girl looks at him perplexed. She does not say anything in response to the proposal. Then he turns around and says that since it is a collective event, no one can get lost. Yu is worried, but her friend tells her that she should go because he helped her with financial aid. He advises her to scream if the boy begins to harass her or behave inappropriately in front of the group. The protagonist announces that they will have a movie night. He explains that this activity is to unite people in the room. Then he points to the box saying that all the seats will be randomly raffled between men and women. The girls like the idea and say that they have not done it in a long time, so the event will surely be interesting. The students line up in front of the raffle and begin to draw the numbers from the box one by one. Some announce their results loudly, while others make noise and discuss the places. Yu looks at his paper and sees number 7006. Remember that the protagonist said that they would sit together. At that moment, one of the teachers looks out the window and sees the boys approaching the girls and starting to talk to them. Suddenly a student approaches the protagonist and asks him what place he drew. Shen replies that it will be much more interesting if they discover it after entering the cinema. She does not like this answer and extends her hand asking him to let her see his paper. The girl sees that number 7007 is written on Shen's paper. She looks at the paper for a second and gets upset when she sees his number. Then she tells him to forget that and go to the cinema. The protagonist holds his paper in his hands without knowing what to do. The boys arrive at the event dressed in various accessories and decorations. One of them spills several bracelets, and another chooses a chain for his neck. The boy asks the protagonist if he likes his hairstyle. The protagonist thinks that no matter what, his friends do not seem adults. He asks the students gathered if they are ready and they answer affirmatively. After that, everyone gathers and begins to leave the university building. The doors of the building open and the students of the protagonist's group begin to leave first. The girls, who had dressed in dresses for this event, leave. Shen realizes that the boys do not communicate with the girls, but he thinks that after watching the movie, several couples could appear. He looks at the door and wonders why Yu has not arrived yet. Suddenly the girl appears and apologizes for making him wait. He apologizes and stumbles a little, saying that he spent a lot of time studying. He was out of breath and tired. The protagonist turns around and starts walking. Yu apologizes again and starts following him. He asks her if she wants to eat or drink, to which she responds negatively to both questions. Chen tells her that the movie is long and that maybe she is hungry. She hesitates to answer because she does not know if she wants something. The protagonist tells her to move on, that he will reach her a little later. Yu is left alone at the entrance of the cinema, finally waiting for the protagonist. He wonders if he is upset with her. The girl is alone and sadness is visible on her face. Suddenly the protagonist arrives from behind with a bag of popcorn. He tells her to move on and not to stand still. Suddenly she stumbles clumsily with something and begins to fall to the ground. She gets scared and screams, but the protagonist holds her with his hands. She looks at him embarrassed. Chen tells his ear to walk more carefully and she continues to feel shy and smiling with his words. Finally, he takes her hand and guides her. Several dozen students are sitting in the cinema watching a movie on the big screen. The protagonist already knows the plot of the movie, but wants to pretend that he does not know it. The boy notices that Yu looks fascinated at the cinema screen. He notices that he has a very thin doll and that he does not eat meat. He thinks that financial help will be very useful to him. She notices his gaze on her and looks at him. The girl feels shy with every contact with the boy. The protagonist pulls the girl's hand so that they take each other by the hand. She starts to get nervous, but Chen pretends that he does not care and asks her to shut up. The most interesting part of the movie is about to begin. She looks at him and does not know what to do in that situation. In the end he says nothing and continues to hold his hand. The movie is over. The protagonist asks him if he liked today's movie. She says she liked it, but that she was sitting for a long time. Chen tells him that he did not seem to him for a long time, so the young man invites her to go to the cinema again. She feels embarrassed and does not know how to respond to that proposal. The protagonist asks him if his silence can be considered a consent. The girl gets nervous and says that that is not what he meant. He says nothing and looks her in the eyes. Yu also looks at him. The tension grows between them. The protagonist is about to say something to the girl, but suddenly he is interrupted by an athlete who passes by and ends up pushing the young man. Chen flies straight to the girl. Yu gets scared when he gets too close and opens his eyes in surprise due to the push. His lips touch his face, which leads to an uncomfortable situation similar to a kiss. The athlete runs faster and apologizes for pushing the protagonist. The protagonist begins to apologize to Yu, but she cannot hear him and begins to panic. The girl is very scared by what is happening and without thinking, pushes the protagonist. He falls straight into a pond. She shouts at him and the athlete observes the situation with surprise. The protagonist comes out of the water and says that he is almost done. The athlete approaches and asks if everything is fine. He thinks that the boy and the girl are arguing. Chen says that the girl has an excellent reaction and extends her hand to help him get out of the water. She accepts and takes him out of the soaked pond. Yu begins to apologize clumsily. He tells her to leave without him because he needs to return to the bedroom and change to dry. The protagonist complains because the plan with the film was a success, but due to a carelessness, all this happened. He leaves the girl and on the way, he sneezes due to the cold. She looks in the distance and when he disappears from sight, the girl is left alone with her thoughts. She finds the situation funny and laughs a little about the embarrassing moment that happened between them. The protagonist finally returns to the dorm staff. One of the students approaches the protagonist and begins to complain about how miserable his life is. Chen asks him if his life is really more miserable than his at that moment. The boy notices that the protagonist is wet and asks him what happened. Chen says that he accidentally fell into the lake and that it is nothing special. A student talks about how the girl with whom he was supposed to exchange the ticket, so he had to sit with his aunt. The rest of the students find it funny, but the boy continues to cry over what happened. The protagonist calms him down a bit. The student remains sad because the girl rejected him. He says it would be better if he simply ignored him and did not give him false hopes. The boy cries and sings sad songs even after dawn. The students complain that he does not let anyone sleep with his singing. The protagonist tells the boy to approach the girl once and for all and call her immediately to go see some games. At that moment, another student arrives and says that he heard about a girl who recently had problems dealing with an unresponsive love. So this girl was from a nearby university and lived on the 3rd floor, and ended up throwing herself from there. The boy says he only had mild wounds. The protagonist immediately thinks of Zhou and asks for the address. The young man remembers the fight he had with her a few days ago. He thinks it could be the girl who got hurt and wants to visit her. Shen begins to pack and leave the room. His friends tell him that it is too late to go anywhere. Shen runs barefoot outside the bedroom while they scream after he forgot to put on his socks. At that moment, the young man arrives at the correct building and says that he is looking for Zio. The security guard asks him what his name is. The protagonist lies and gives the girl's father's name. The security calls and says that a man wants to see her, and that he came to visit her. Zio goes out on the street in home clothes. He thinks his father is looking for her at this time of day. Suddenly he hears a voice and turns around, noticing the protagonist. Shen says he only gave him his father's name so he could go down to talk to him. She calls him stupid and turns around to leave. The protagonist tries to reason with her and tells her to discuss everything calmly. She replies that he should discuss everything with the girls at the bar. He tells her that he can go, but that tomorrow he will come with a large poster and put it on the back of his bedroom, saying that she can study because he will take care of the children. Zio gets angry with the proposed portal, but sighs and accepts to talk to him. The protagonist says that he called her many times, but she did not answer the phone, so he could not explain to her what happened the night of the fight. He says that Sibo had a fight with his mother that day and asked them to go out together. She asks him if his friend invited him to that bar. The girl finds it hard to believe. The protagonist says it was a mistake to have accepted that offer and that now he understands it, he must have rejected it. She asks what he was doing at the nightclub. Shen replies that he was just playing pool with Sibo. He tells him that if he does not believe it, he can call his friend and ask him. Zio listens to the explanation and looks at him in silence for a while, then moves away from him. Shen does not understand what kind of reaction that is. She stays there for a few seconds. Both the boy and the girl are silent. Soon, an uncomfortable silence falls on them. Suddenly the girl tells him to accompany her to the library at 7:30 in the morning, without delay. Without giving him time to answer, he turns around and runs back to his bedroom. He watches her without understanding what just happened. The next day, at 7:30 in the morning, the protagonist arrives and stays at the entrance wondering why she made such an early appointment in the morning. At that moment, she sees some boys with food packages in their hands. They were supposed to come to give breakfast to their girls. Suddenly the doors open and 3 girls leave the library. One of them is Zio. The girl looks at the protagonist, then the boys who were waiting nearby with food. Everyone runs to Zio. They begin to deliver food packages to him. One of them bought an egg, another bought bread, and the third bought a full breakfast. Zio thanks them, but politely rejects the food offered. One of the boys leaves a package of food nearby. He is upset by the girl's rejection and says that although she rejects him, something can work between them someday. But it is interrupted when the protagonist takes the food that the boy left and begins to eat. The boy does not understand how this is possible. The protagonist continues to eat without paying attention to the protests. Then he asks the boy if he would like to give him his drink. At that moment, Zio begins to drag him. The protagonist complains because he wanted to eat more. The 3 boys look at her annoyingly. After a while, Zio and the protagonist meet at the entrance to the library. She asks him if Chen is interested in knowing who those boys were. He asks who they were. The girl believes that the question was asked without sincerity and does not want to answer it. He gives her the bag and tells her that she will look for the book and that he can find a place. For now, he sits in a free desk in the library and begins to wait for the girl. He is bored. Zio returns with books and says that he brought him books about his specialty. Shen replies that he is more interested in law books. She asks him why he needs those books if he does not study that discipline. The young man replies that students often start their own businesses and knowing the laws can be of great help. Then he says that he actually does not want to read them and prefers to ask a pretty girl from the university to read those books. Zio gets angry at these words, so they remain silent for a while they study. The protagonist notices that there is a boy in the distance watching us. Shen asks her if she reads books about her specialty and she responds affirmatively. The protagonist observes that many times men resort to her to ask for help and she agrees. He asks her if she used that this morning to scare those boys. The girl accepts that he did not anyway. Suddenly the protagonist begins to get up from the table and says that he wants to make sure that no one bothers her again. She does not understand what he is talking about. Chen puts his hand on the table and approaches the girl who does not know how to react to this. He leans over and kisses her on the lips. She is surprised by this and does nothing in response. Zio blushes a lot of shame but does not stop with the kiss. The scene passes, and then the protagonist spits a red liquid in the sink. He looks in the mirror and realizes that the girl almost bites his lip. Chen remembers the kiss and thinks that for the girl it was her first kiss, that's why he got angry. His friend next to him asks him if he has a purple lip. He replies that he only bit her a little and that there is nothing to worry about. The boy tells him to be careful and also reminds him that soon there will be a review with the teacher, so he cannot forget it. Chen hears the sound of the phone and goes to the balcony. Someone tells him that probably a girl is looking for him at that moment. He enters the room and answers the phone. Zhao asks him about the state of his mouth and worries if he bit his lip. Shen points out that his friend is sitting next to him and is possibly listening to his conversation with the girl. The friend gets jealous of this conversation and wonders if the leader has a pretty girl. A while later, there is action in the university auditorium. Someone is calling Yu. The happy girl looks at her and tells her that her financial aid request for low-income students has been approved. Yu thanks her and is happy with the news she received. She feels much more comfortable with her friend than with the others. The girl says that Chen is reliable and Yu agrees with this. The boys enter the room, including the protagonist. The girls notice it and also pay attention to Yu. The girl remembers the previous situation and feels embarrassed, quickly looking the other way, away from Chen. The protagonist asks her if her financial aid request has been approved, and while she speaks, she casually places her elbow on her shoulder. She, noticing this, wonders why she is doing it. Chen simply replies that he is only greeting. Then with a confident tone, he affirms that it was thanks to his merit that the request was approved. While they solve this matter, he adds that they still have to thank the secretary. Leaning towards Yu, he suggests that they give him essential gifts such as cakes as a sign of gratitude. However, his friend pushes him aside, asking him how exactly he plans to thank the secretary. Chen replies that Yu should also contribute to the gift. Curious, Yu asks what he should buy. One of his friends jokingly mentions that Yu constantly eats dried chilies and suggests giving some to the secretary. Another girl intervenes saying that Yu found wild vegetables near the dormitory and waters them every day. Yu immediately feels embarrassed to hear this, and an uncomfortable silence settles in the group. Chen then proposes to peel the vegetables and chilies before handing them over to the secretary as a small gesture of gratitude. Although the protagonist does not know how he knows the chili, he soon realizes that half of the group has never tried it either. Yu, surprised, asks if most people have really never tried chili. 2 days later, Chen and his friends walk down the street chatting. One of the students complains that his game was not saved. Suddenly Yu appears, looking frustrated, and begins to complain to the protagonist. He tells him that Yu is crying. Worried, Chen asks what happened. Yu explains that after he suggested giving the chilies as a gift, Yu went to the garden to pick up some, and while he was working, he was bitten by insects, leaving red marks and discomfort on his skin. Wanting to avoid bothering his roommates with the strong smell, he left the chilies on the balcony during the night. The next morning he took them to the classroom, but none of the students wanted to try them, complaining about the unpleasant aroma of the vegetables. One of Chen's friends, who had already had breakfast, refused to take the risk of trying it. Realizing this, the protagonist assumes that Yu collapsed in tears at his rejection. Chen arrives at the classroom and sees Yu sitting alone in the corner. She remains silent, looking down, without any student feeling close to her. Discreetly, she hides her arm, still marked by the bites of insects. The teacher enters the classroom and instructs everyone to take a seat, as the class is about to begin. However, Chen goes ahead and announces that he must delay the lesson for a moment. Standing in front of the class, he prepares to eat. The room is silent and all eyes are fixed on him. Yu does not notice with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Chen approaches the plate of chilies, lifts the lid and looks at them for a few seconds without saying a word. The students watch each of his movements anxiously. Then without hesitation, he takes a chili with his fingers and puts it in his mouth, chewing slowly. The room remains still while Yu watches him closely. Chen continues to chew. The crunchy sound resonates in the quiet classroom. Then with a satisfied expression, he declares that the chilies are delicious. Raising the bowl, he invites others to try it. A student named Yong is the first to accept the offer and soon more students begin to eat. As they try the chilies, they express their surprise for how good they are, coinciding that you should never judge a book by its cover. More students arrive, intrigued by the commotion, and begin to eat together with the others. Yu, observing everything that happens, smiles slowly when he sees his classmates enjoy the food. His sadness fades away. Excited voices fill the room while some students comment that the dish is so good that it could even be sold. Others agree, calling it a rare opportunity to try something unique. Overwhelmed by emotion, Yu begins to cry, this time of happiness. The tears dry as his classmates continue to eat, transforming what was once a moment of shame into one of warmth and acceptance.